26th of March, and I'm looking carefully at what we can do to ensure that we do ensure there is decision making after that date.
Indeed. Tom Burscliffe.
2, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State and I have frequent discussions and meetings with Northern Ireland businesses. In the last few weeks I have met Newry Chamber of Commerce, Thales, Willowbrook Foods and tomorrow Bombardier. The government's provided £3.5 million for Queen's Belfast Precision Medicine Centre, £700,000 for Randox Diagnostics, £1 million for Northern Ireland SMEs Research and Development, and this afternoon we will legislate to hold business rates to a 0% real terms rise as well.
Tom Burscliffe.
I very much welcome that work, but what steps has he specifically taken to promote Northern Ireland internationally as a successful business hub and first-class place to invest?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the numbers speak for themselves. Over 900 international companies have already invested in Northern Ireland, supported by government investments like the ones I just mentioned in global sectors like biomedicine and defence. Political stability has been a key foundation of this success, which is why restoring devolved government at Stormont is so critical.
Indeed. Lady Herman.
Very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I want to ask the Minister how he is going to reassure the business community today after the very serious warning yesterday by the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, David Stirling, that there would be grave consequences if we have a no-deal Brexit.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think that a number of people will have raised their eyebrows at such politically charged comments from a civil servant. The point I would make is simply this, that we have a meaningful vote coming up in this place next week, where the Attorney-General and the Prime Minister will be able to come back and tell us the fruits of their reactions, of their discussions in Brussels. And the simple answer to avoiding any of the scenarios which people may or may not agree with, which were being painted by David Stirling, is to find a deal which will work and which therefore means we won't be in no-deal territory, and that will, I think, solve the problem, I hope, for everybody.
Dr. Andrew Mearison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Minister concerned about the possible impact on small businesses of the changes proposed to non-domestic renewable heat incentives in the legislation that we're about to consider? And is he particularly cautious about advice he may be receiving from the Department for Energy, since, of course, it was the Department for Energy that got us into this fix in the first place?
Well, Mr. Speaker, without wanting to prejudge this afternoon's debate, where, as my honourable friend, the Select Committee Chairman, rightly says, we will be going through this in a lot more detail, he is absolutely right that the Renewable Heat Incentive Scheme has been the subject of a great deal of concerned commentary because it has dramatically broken its budgets and is not a sustainable solution. I think everybody is treating any proposals for it with a great degree of concern and scrutiny just because of that history, but I'm sure that we will have a chance to go through it in more detail, and we will try and make sure that any proposals which are legislated on do not suffer from the previous version's faults.
Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, I have been married to a lady from County Armagh for quite some time. And through my marriage, I've come to know the image of Northern Irish food products, to mention Blackbush, to mention Tato Crisps, and Flanagan's most excellent sausage from the city of Armagh. Would the Edgerman government agree with me that marketing Northern Ireland special food could be one way we could really boost business in Northern Ireland, not just within the UK, but to a world market?
Mr. Speaker, one of the things which I think Britain has cottoned on to later, and UK has cottoned on to later than many other parts of the world, is this notion of local food and the marketability of local food and the ability of that to forge a local brand, not just for food but also for tourism more broadly as well. So in congratulating him on his marital status and his success there, I'm sure that he's on to something important as well.
No reason to doubt that at all. Alan Brown.
Number 4, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 4 and 8 together. Leaving with a deal on the 29th of March is our clear objective, and that is what we are working towards. It remains, though, the responsibility of the UK Government to continue preparations for the full range of potential outcomes, including no deal. And as we do so, and as decisions are made, we will take full account of the unique circumstances of Northern Ireland.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that yesterday a senior HMRC official told the Public Accounts Committee that even if border processes were announced today,
there is insufficient time for traders who wish to comply to get ready. It was also admitted that while HMRC have been working on possible trade processes, they can't tell traders. With 23 days to go to Brexit, is this not an absolute disgrace, this lack of clarity?
No, Mr Speaker, I disagree with the honourable gentleman. The government is taking appropriate and responsible measures in the event that we end up with no deal. But there is a way to avoid no deal, and that is to vote for the deal next week.
Order. Just before I call the honourable gentleman, the member for Edinburgh East, I hope the whole House will wish to join me in congratulating the honourable gentleman on a very special birthday today. I cannot believe that he is the age that I have been advised he is, but I suppose all things are possible. He seems in very good nick to me. Mr Tommy Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and let me assure you that, contrary to popular belief, my political conviction is not being moderated or mellowed with the passing of the years. Can I ask the Secretary of State, the latest Northern Ireland budget included £16.5 million for the police service of Northern Ireland to prepare for Brexit. Can I ask how much of that money is being allocated to the policing of border infrastructure, either at the border itself or some distance away from it?
Good question.
Well, Mr Speaker, can I join you in wishing the honourable gentleman a very happy birthday? I hope he gets to enjoy it and also enjoys some more Northern Ireland business later in the day, which he can come and join us with. He asked about spending on policing. The government has ensured that the Police Service of Northern Ireland have the resources they need, but it is down to the Chief Constable to determine how that money is spent and how it is operationally used. But I also want to remind him that in the joint report we were very clear that we were committed to no new infrastructure at the border and no related checks or controls.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Once we've left the European Union, one of the important aspects of the economic make-up of our country will be how the UK Shared Prosperity Fund will work. Will my right honourable friend confirm to me that the UK Shared Prosperity Fund will be run on a UK-wide basis, with the UK Government playing an important part on the ground in the devolved nations and regions of this country?
My honourable friend is right. The UK Shared Prosperity Fund is an important part of our post-Brexit future. We are working as a government to ensure that that UK fund is properly spent, and we'll be consulting on it shortly.
Mr Gavin Robinson.
Much, Mr Speaker. The Secretary of State will have heard Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, yesterday in the Economic Affairs Committee of the other place, downgrading his concerns around no deal as a result of national government's preparedness. Does she have the same confidence in the preparedness of the Northern Ireland Civil Service?
Mr Speaker, the Northern Ireland Civil Service are working incredibly hard on no-deal preparedness. There are regular meetings that my officials hold with civil servants in Northern Ireland. It would be better if we had devolved government, because there would be ministers to whom those civil servants would be accountable. But I repeat again, of course, the best way to ensure that any of this preparedness is avoided, and we don't need any of it, is to vote for the deal.
Indeed. Mr Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Yesterday's letter from David Stelling, the head of Northern Ireland Civil Service, gave the honest assessment that it was apparent that businesses in Northern Ireland are not adequately prepared for no-deal Brexit. Mr Speaker, who could possibly blame Northern Irish businesses? The UK Government isn't prepared either. Just ask the Transport Secretary. But given this stark advice, why won't the Secretary of State support calls to take no deal off the negotiating table now?
Mr Speaker, I disagree with the honourable gentleman, who I have enormous respect for, that the government is not prepared for no deal. We are working towards preparing for all eventual outcomes, but we want to leave the European Union with a deal. We want to ensure we respect the results of the referendum and leave with a deal, and the best way to do that is vote for the deal.
Yes, indeed. Mr Christian Matheson.
Is vote for the deal.
Yes, indeed. Mr Christian Matheson.
Thank you. Question 5, sir.
Mr Speaker, we debated this point at some length in the Northern Ireland Budget Bill yesterday, and the frustration from all sides at the lack of a Stormont executive was palpable. As my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, mentioned in her earlier reply, she's met with the 5 main political parties and the Irish Government recently, and I can confirm that discussions are ongoing since then.
Christian Matheson.
Does the Minister share my concern at the increasing polarisation of politics in the UK and particularly in Northern Ireland? And is he satisfied that there is sufficient diversity and pluralism within political representation to make the re-establishment of the Assembly a success?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I mean, we elect the politicians we deserve, and he's absolutely right that there are periodic calls for a greater variety of representation and range of representation, both in this Parliament and I'm sure in Stormont too. The difficulty, of course, in Northern Ireland is that Northern Ireland's politics have been far more polarised for a very long time, and we are trying to collectively and on all sides usher them back towards the centre ground and towards cooperation at least.
David Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Secretary of State acknowledge today that the lack of re-establishing the Assembly is not down to this party? This party does not have red lines. It's one party that is causing the difficulty, that's Sinn Féin. Would she acknowledge that today?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think I will probably quote the Labour Party spokesman on this yesterday when he said that the existence of preconditions or red lines is quite frequently a facet of talks processes, and the point is to get a process which allows us to overcome those preconditions, and if we allow ourselves to be sidetracked by their existence in the first place, we will never get anywhere towards actually succeeding.
Dan Jarvis.
Number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the Government is carefully considering the over 17,000 responses received in response to the recent consultation on legacy. We are determined to replace the current system with one that is fair, balanced and proportionate, and which commands widespread support.
Dan Jarvis.
I thank the Secretary of State for her reply. She knows that our ability to secure a lasting peace depends on the support of all of the communities involved. So can she assure the House that when working to address the legacy of Northern Ireland's past, she will be considerate of our Army and Armed Forces veterans, many of whom are now pensioners?
I absolutely agree with the honourable gentleman, and I'm very grateful to him that we've been able to speak personally about this matter prior to this and to hear his words of advice and wisdom, because he has great experience and expertise in this area, and I do value his contribution. I want to make sure that what we take forward and we legislate for, something that has been needed since the 1998 Belfast Agreement, is one that does command widespread support. It has to command support in this House and the other place, and support in Northern Ireland, and it absolutely has to work for our veterans.
Emma Littlepengilly.
Well over 90% of the murders and injuries caused during the Troubles in Northern Ireland were caused by acts of terrorism. Very few prosecutions and investigations are underway. Innocent victims are being left behind with thousands of unsolved cases. When is the Secretary of State going to address this issue and put in place a mechanism to investigate the over 90% of acts of terrorism that caused those murders and injuries?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady sets out the figures very, very powerfully. Over 90% of the killings during the Troubles were at the hands of terrorists. Every single one of those was a crime. The fewer than 10% that were at the hands of the military and police were not crimes. They were people acting under orders and under instruction and fulfilling their duties in a dignified and appropriate way. I look forward to working with her more to ensure that we can deliver the much-needed reforms and changes that we all want to see.
I very much hope the Honourable Gentleman for Barnsley Central is not indisposed, because he's most irregular to beetle out of the chamber before the exchanges on the question have been concluded. The Honourable Gentleman is normally the very embodiment of courtesy, so if he's not feeling well, I hope he gets well soon, and if he's well, he'd better get back into the chamber sooner rather than later. It's an elementary rule that new members must grasp. Don't leave the chamber until the exchanges on your question have been completed, because I'm sure you're all interested in the views that other people wish to express, as well as in your own. I'm sure I can say that without fear of contradiction. Sir Edward Lee.
Number 7, sir.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend asked what discussions the Secretary of State has had with Cabinet colleagues about the Irish backstop, and I think the short answer is a lot. The country and this Parliament seems to have been discussing little else for weeks, and it's the same with knobs on for the Cabinet.
Sir Edward Lee.
Surely never has something so important, namely Brexit, been put at risk in preventing something that will never happen, namely a hard border in Northern Ireland? Why don't the EU, the Republic and the United Kingdom government simply attach an instrument to the withdrawal agreement, making clear that we will never impose a hard border in Northern Ireland? And this can be achieved in time and in goodwill, first with customs arrangements and then with a free trade deal backed by technology. It's so simple. Let's do it.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises a creative potential legal solution, which I think he's already discussed in an adjournment debate 2 weeks ago. The whole House will know that the Attorney-General is currently involved in detailed negotiations over how to modify the backstop in line with Parliament's wishes, and ultimately it must be for him to judge whether or not my honourable friend's proposal gets him closer to a legally effective solution which will allow him to change his advice. I will make sure he's aware of it so he can incorporate it if it is worthwhile.
We'll get the right honourable gentleman in. We had him down as coming in on question 7. If that's not his wish, we'll do our best to accommodate the right honourable gentleman, of course. Mr Gregory Campbell.
Mr Speaker, in discussions with ministerial colleagues, can the Minister indicate if they are indicating to him that at this very late stage in discussions with the European Union there is a sliver of light beginning to emerge, that they understand the need for fundamental change to the backstop?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I suspect that is well above my pay grade, I'm sorry to say. But also I'm sure that we will all want to hear what the Attorney-General and the Prime Minister have to say when it comes to the meaningful vote next Tuesday.
Mr Ronald J. Wardener.
Number 10, sir.
Mr Speaker, the threat from dissident Republican terrorism continues to be severe in Northern Ireland. This government's first priority is to keep people safe and secure. Vigilance against this continuing threat is essential, and we remain determined to ensure that terrorism never succeeds.
Ronald J. Wardener.
Can my right honourable friend shed light on reports in the Times that my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, plans to bring forward a limit on veteran prosecutions in the Queen's speech in order to, as my right honourable friend, the member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip, argued in the Telegraph, we must stop gesture politics and start delivering natural justice?
Well, Mr Speaker, I could firstly just say to my honourable friend not to believe everything he reads in the newspapers, but what I can assure him is that I am working closely with the Defence Secretary and the Attorney-General and members across this House to ensure we can deliver a new system that works for the people of Northern Ireland, works for the victims of terrorism and works very importantly for our veterans and retired police officers.
David Hanson.
Where are we with the European arrest warrant in 3 weeks' time?
Well, Mr Speaker, the way to guarantee the European arrest warrant continues in 3 weeks' time is vote for the deal.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank the Secretary of State for a response. Secretary of State, there's been a bomb attack in Londonderry. There's been various shootings across the whole of the Northern Ireland. We had 3 partial bombs in Heathrow, Gatwick and Waterloo Station yesterday, originating from the Republic of Ireland, at least the posties did. What discussions has the Secretary of State had with our equivalent in the Republic of Ireland to address these issues, which clearly state the Republic of Ireland is a haven for terrorists?
Well, Mr Speaker, the matter of cross-border security and East-West relations is a matter that we've discussed at both British-Irish intergovernmental conferences we've held in the last 12 months. But close work between the Guards and the PSNI is absolutely imperative to ensuring the safety of us all.
Indeed. Oh, yes, very well. Mr Paisley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Would the Secretary of State care to take the opportunity from the dispatch box to thank Alistair Hamilton, my constituent, the former head, or soon-to-be former head, of Invest Northern Ireland, for the 10 years of great service that he has given to Northern Ireland in attracting the highest levels of inward investment our country has ever seen.
Mr Speaker, I'm sure that the honourable gentleman is referring to the contribution that investment has made to the security of Northern Ireland, but he will notice I have my Invest NI pen with me.
Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I say to the Secretary of State that the idea
that the European arrest warrant should be left as a matter of a lottery as to whether the Prime Minister gets legislation through or not simply cannot be in the interest of the people of this country. Will she now get a grip, talk to the Prime Minister and insist that we have the European arrest warrant sorted, irrespective of outcomes in this House next week?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to see the access to the European arrest warrant or a similar instrument continuing into the future. I, as a Minister in the Home Office, worked very hard to ensure that we had access to the European arrest warrant as the United Kingdom, and I want to see it continue. But I just have to gently remind the honourable gentleman that there is a mechanism to ensure all of these matters continue, and that is the withdrawal agreement, and that means voting for the deal.
Order. Just before I call the right honourable gentleman to ask you a second question, a lot of very noisy private conversations taking place, including on the government benches, where I'm sure members wish to listen to their illustrious Secretary of State as she replies to the inquiries put to her. Mr. Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State knows that the security situation also does depend on trust. When David Cameron was Prime Minister, he recognised the very special circumstances of the Pat Finucane case and established an independent inquiry into those circumstances. The Supreme Court decided last week that that was a flawed process. What remedy does the Secretary of State propose unless it is indeed a second public inquiry?
Speaker, the judgment in the Supreme Court from the Supreme Court on the Pat Finucane case came out last week. It is a complicated matter because the judgment, whilst it says that the Article 2 obligations on the government have not been thoroughly fulfilled, does not suggest the next stage forward. I am looking very carefully at the judgment and considering the next steps.
Finally, Alison Thewlis.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the Government recognises the sensitivity of this issue and the range of views expressed by stakeholders on all sides of the debate. We take our obligations under the Convention seriously, including having had positive dialogues with the committee very recently.
Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much. At CEDAW on the 25th of February, Women's Aid Northern Ireland raised a series of concerns, including lack of a gender equality strategy, a violence against women strategy, not applying a gendered approach to post-conflict transition, and the disproportionate impact of UK government policies such as the two-child policy and the rape clause. What is she going to do about this, and why will she leave women in Northern Ireland behind?
Mr. Speaker, I absolutely disagree that this is what this government is doing. We are determined to ensure we fulfil all our obligations on human rights matters. The matters raised by CEDAW, many of them are matters that need to be legislated for instalment. That's why we need devolved government instalment sooner rather than later.
Finally, Sir Geoffrey Donald, sir. The Secretary of State will know that in Northern Ireland many women believe that both lives matter. And will she agree with me that this is an issue to be dealt with by the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive, and we should respect the devolution settlement? And it's disappointing that the SNP want to breach the devolution settlement.
I do agree with the right honourable gentleman. I think what's interesting is that even the majority of those people who say in polls that they want to see change to the abortion laws in Northern Ireland are very clear, about 64%, that they want those changes instalment.
Order. Colleagues, we are joined for Prime Minister's questions today. I know that the Honourable Gentleman Member for Stone will be keenly interested in this announcement rather than in his own, no doubt, fascinating private conversation by the former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and by the Australian High Commissioner. They are both extremely welcome. We value our excellent relations with your country. We admire your nation. We respect your cricketers. And a lot of us have a particularly high regard for your illustrious tennis players. From this Speaker's point of view, none greater than the illustrious Rockhampton Rocket Rod Laver. Questions to the Prime Minister. Tim Farron.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will join you in welcoming our Australian friends to the gallery, but I'm reminded of the occasion when another former Australian Prime Minister, John Howard, visited this House. He watched Prime Minister's questions and he commented afterwards that however lively PMQ's was here, it was a vicarage tea party compared to Australia. Mr. Speaker, the death of anyone through an act of violence is an appalling tragedy for us all. Our thoughts and prayers are with friends and families of victims. The responsibility for these crimes lies with the perpetrators of them, but we must all do more to ensure that justice is served and to tackle the root causes of this violence so that we can bring it to an end and ensure the safety of our young people. Mr. Speaker, I will be holding a summit in Number 10 in the coming days to bring together ministers, community leaders, agencies and others, and I will also be meeting with the victims of these appalling crimes to listen to their stories and to explore what more we can do as a whole society to tackle this problem. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in paying tribute to Professor Lord Bhattacharya, who died sadly last week. His creation of the Warwick Manufacturing Group was truly a pioneering partnership between academia and industry. Our thoughts are with his family and friends, and I know he will be sorely missed. This morning I have been meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Tim Farron.
Mr. Speaker, may I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister and to pass my condolences on to the families and loved ones of those who have been the victims of tragic crimes this week. Mr. Speaker, Britain spent £27 billion bailing out the banks, and they have repaid us by closing down 3,000 branches since 2016, including this week the last branch in Grange. They've also failed to compensate innocent customers who've lost £2 billion in fraud. So will she agree with me that the banks have taken without giving for far too long? And will she meet with me so we can force the banks to compensate victims of fraud, to compensate the communities they have abandoned, and to prevent the banks closing the last branch in town?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that he talks about banks closing branches. Of course, as people's behaviour in terms of their access to their finances changes, then banks respond to that. They're commercial organisations. Those are decisions that they take. He talks about the issue of compensation. Of course, this is an issue that has been raised across the House in the past, and it is a matter that is being taken up and being looked at by the Financial Services Ombudsman.
Mr. Simon Orr.
Mr. Speaker. Today sees the start of Lent, traditionally a time of abstinence and giving things up. Recently, it's become a season of doing something new and positive. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that it would do our national soul some good if we all took up voting with the government to leave the EU with her good deal and in an orderly fashion on the 29th of March?
Can I thank my honourable friend? He has put forward a very positive suggestion for members of this House during Lent to vote with the government in the meaningful vote, and then, of course, across this House, we would all be able to give up being a member of the European Union on the 29th of March.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to Lord Bhattacharya, who died last week. As she said, he was a champion of the car industry and manufacturing in general, and played a key role in saving Jaguar Land Rover, safeguarding jobs, but crucially ensuring international research is done in the UK, and I think we thank him for everything that he did. Tomorrow is International Women's Day, and I'm delighted that from our point of view the debate will be opened by my friend, the Honourable Member for Lewisham East, who herself is the daughter of a Windrush generation, and we will be making the case to close the gender pay gap as our determination to improve the lot of women in our society. And in that vein, Mr. Speaker, can we congratulate the member for Liverpool Waverley Tree on giving birth to a son this morning? I join the House. I join the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. I join the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, in sending our thoughts and prayers to the families of those that have lost young people. Yusuf Mackay and Joseph Chesney, both 17 years old, and the 9th and 10th teenagers murdered already this year. 285 people have been stabbed to death last year, the highest level ever. I welcome the fact the Prime Minister has announced that COBRA is being convened, but what extra funding is being provided to address the root causes of both knife crime and the increasing levels of violent crime on the streets of all of our towns and cities?
First of all, I'd like to join the Right Honourable Gentleman in congratulating the Honourable Member for Liverpool-Wavertree on the birth of her son. Sure, we're all pleased to hear that that has gone well. Can I also say, in relation to International Women's Day, that I'm very pleased that today marks the launch of the book by his honourable friend, the member for Leeds West, of Women of Westminster, Women Who Changed Politics. I hope that book will be an inspiration to other women to come into politics and see a career in this House. And can I also congratulate the England women's football team, who last night won the She Believes Cup, defeating Japan in doing so. The Right Honourable Gentleman has raised the question specifically of knife crime, which I referred to in my opening comments. Of course, as I said, any death of a young person is a terrible tragedy through an act of violence, and we have seen too many young lives, too many lives of promise and potential being cut short. Responsibility for these terrible crimes does lie with the perpetrators, and we will always stand with the victims to ensure that criminals are brought to justice. But we will only defeat the scourge of violence if we understand and address its complex root causes. Yes, that does mean ensuring that all agencies, including the police, have the right resources and powers to do their jobs. It means tackling the drug crime that is fueling gang violence in our cities and exporting it across the country, and it means intervening at every stage to turn young people away from violence, and that is exactly what the government is doing.
Mr. Speaker, many of us in this House will have sat in the living rooms of homes where a young person has lost their lives through knife crime, and will never forget that experience and never forget that feeling of hopelessness and loss that those families are going through. We owe it to those families and those young people that lost their lives to do far more about knife crime and far more about ensuring there are sufficient resources for the police to deal with it. Sarah Thornton, the National Chief Police Council, said, and I quote, "We need much stronger leadership from government, and there needs to be more funding." The Metropolitan Police Commissioner said yesterday, of course there is some link between violent crime on the streets and police numbers. 21,000 police officers' jobs have been cut. Violent crime is at the highest level since comparative records began. If there are sufficient police numbers, can the Prime Minister please explain why yesterday the Defence Secretary was offering to send in the military to assist with knife crime?
I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, as the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police has recognised that the causes of knife crime are complex, she said police alone won't sort this issue out. We can't arrest our way out of this problem, and I agree, and that's why we need to tackle it across a number of fronts. Now, we must continue to enforce the laws that bear down on violent crime. That involves the Offensive Weapons Bill, where we've introduced the knife crime prevention orders. Those were asked for by the police, and we're introducing those orders. We'll intervene early to stop young people going down into a life of crime and becoming involved in crime. We've published the Serious Violence Strategy. The Serious Violence Task Force is working. We've also put £200 million into the Youth Endowment Fund, and our Early Intervention Youth Fund has already funded 29 projects working with police and crime commissioners. And we do ensure that police have the right resources. £460 million more money available this year, nearly double that, nearly £1 billion extra available next year. But we also need to ensure that we're understanding the different use and misuse of drugs that is fueling a lot of this crime. And that's why my Right Honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has set up the Independent Drugs Misuse Review, which will be led by Dame Carol Black.
Jeremy Corbyn. Mr. Speaker, the police clearly do not have the resources to deal with it. Safer neighbourhoods teams have been cut. Community police officers have been cut. Many areas see no police officers at all. There is nobody to supervise these special orders the Prime Minister is talking about. Perhaps she could listen to Nazir Afzal, former Chief Prosecutor of Greater Manchester. Tragically, his 17-year-old relative was recently stabbed to death in Birmingham, and he said this: "When you reduce police numbers by 21,000, there isn't the intelligence anymore. There isn't the neighbourhood policing anymore. Does the Prime Minister now regret the cuts in police numbers, and will she undertake that on this review they will be restored to the level they were formerly at?"
to the right honourable gentleman. As I've just indicated, we are putting more resources into the police. This year... It's no good members on the opposition benches standing up and saying, no, you're not. It is a fact that more money is being put into the police this year, that more money is being put into the police next year. The real question is not, are we putting more money into the police? Because we are. The real question is, why did the Labour Party oppose that money going into the police?
Mr. Speaker, violent crime has doubled under the Tories' watch. And I've had a letter from Mike in Gosport where he says, yes, it's important, he's got something to say. The crime rate has run out of control because there is no police presence, adding, it's become a really unsafe town to live in. I think Mike speaks for millions of people around the country. When are towns, such as Gosport and others, going to get the resources they need for the safer neighbourhoods teams they need and the local police they need to tackle rising violent crime and provide the intelligence from which arrests can be made against those that have committed these crimes?
I say to the right honourable gentleman, as we put more resources and make more resources available to police, they're available to forces across the country, including, of course, Hampshire. But can I also say to him that, of course, we look at the powers and the resources that the police need. That's why we are not just putting more resources in, but increasing the powers that the police have. We introduced the knife crime prevention orders in the Offensive Weapons Bill. That's an important step we've taken. It's a step we've taken because the police asked us to do this. But if the right honourable gentleman wants the police to be able to do their job on the streets, he needs to answer the question, to tell this House why it was that when we increased the powers of the police, to deal with those who were carrying knives and to put custodial sentences on those who were caught twice carrying knives, the right honourable gentleman voted against it.
Jeremy Corbyn! Crime went down when Labour was in office. We increased the numbers of police officers and the Safer Neighbourhoods teams. Police officers telling me there's simply not enough of them to do the job. Hampshire alone has lost 1,000 police officers and their funding has been cut by 70 million. Does the Prime Minister understand the scale of need here? The Local Government Association says local services face a funding gap of 3.2 billion this year. And by the way, that's double in 1 year alone what the Stronger Towns Fund is offering over 7 years. The numbers of rapes, murders and other serious crimes committed by offenders on parole has risen by more than 50% since privatisation of the probation service was introduced 4 years ago. At least one company wrongly classified offenders as low risk in order to meet government targets. Does her government now accept that privatising the probation service to profit-making companies has been a disaster and should be reversed and should be brought back completely into the public service?
I say to the right honourable gentleman, what we want to do is to ensure that when we're working in relation, looking at these issues of probation, that we are actually genuinely reducing the level of reoffending, and that is about a rehabilitation method. That is about a rehabilitation method that looks at a variety of issues, that looks at the question of the home that an individual coming out of prison has, that looks at their employment and looks at their relationship with their family. This is something that wasn't being done fully under the last Labour government. That's why we saw reoffending rates at such a high level, and it's why we need to take action. But he comes back, he keeps raising issues. I think what he's doing, and I welcome the fact that he's accepting that dealing with serious violence, dealing with knife crime, actually requires us to act across a number of areas. So, for example, it is about the work we're doing with young people. It's about supporting intervention in accident and emergency department in hospitals. We're expanding our support to the charity Red Thread, which introduced its youth violence intervention work, now in hospitals in Birmingham and Nottingham as well as in London. And we're supporting the £3.6 million National County Lines Coordination Centre. In just 2 separate weeks of law enforcement action, we have seen more than 1,000 arrests and 1,300 individuals being safeguarded. We commend all those police officers and other agencies involved in that work. The government is giving them the support they need to do their job.
Mr. Speaker, the problem is that violent crime has doubled. The rise, Mr. Speaker, has been driven by austerity, something the Prime Minister told us a few months ago was over. Cuts to the police, rising poverty. The police and Home Office recognise the link, even if the Prime Minister doesn't. But, Mr. Speaker, the issues are wider. The privatisation of the probation service has been a disaster. Mental health services are under-resourced. Youth and children's services are in crisis. More than 600 youth centres have been closed. 3,500 youth workers have lost their jobs. Funding for colleges and schools has been cut and exclusions are rising. The public services that were there to support young people have been systematically stripped away, and everyone can see the consequences of that. Can the Prime Minister not recognise there has to be a holistic response to this? You cannot keep communities safe on the cheap by cuts and privatisation. You have to invest in all of our communities in every part of this country, something this government is incapable of doing.
We put more money into local authorities. The right honourable gentleman voted against it. We put more money into our police.
Order! A very discordant noise from the opposition backbenches. The question has been asked and, broadly speaking, heard, and the answer will be heard. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've put more money into our schools. We're putting more money. 2.6 billion over these 2 years. More money into our local authorities, 1.3 billion next year. Voted against by the right honourable gentleman and the Labour Party. More money into our police, nearly £1 billion extra available to them next year. Voted against by the right honourable gentleman and the Labour Party. But you know, the right honourable gentleman stands up here and he talks about austerity. If he's that concerned about austerity, you would think that he would want to make sure that it could never, ever happen again. And let's remember why we had to take those measures. Because of the state of the economy left by the Labour Party. But what would his policies mean? Higher borrowing, higher taxes, crashing our economy, less money for our public services. He'd take us right back to austerity square one.
Mr. Merriman.
Mr. Speaker, across the country, freeholders and leaseholders are being ripped off by management companies charging excessive service charges, often for services they do not require. Many of these people are vulnerable pensioners and are trapped in McCarthy and Stone properties with their asset depreciating thanks to the dominant involvement of First Port and Vincent Chenguis. Could I ask the Prime Minister for 2 reforms? Firstly, ground rents at peppercorn levels for retirement homes. Secondly, bring in a charging schedule and an automatic retendering process so all freeholders and long leaseholders can bid with their own community interest companies to deliver services which they actually require.
Can I say to my honourable friend that I recognise this is an issue that is of real concern to many constituents. It's why we've committed to clamping down on those agents who abuse the system and protecting leaseholders and renters who are suffering at the hands of rogue agents every day from unexpected costs or from poor quality repairs for excessive fees. We've asked Lord Best to chair a working group to look at regulating and professionalising property agents, and that will include reviewing the standards around the transparency of service charges and other fees and charges, how they're presented to consumers, and putting them on into a statutory code for managing agents. But I'm sure that my right honourable friend, the Communities Secretary, will have heard the issue that my honourable friend has raised and will be happy to meet him to discuss this further.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Tovie MacDonald is 87 years old. She was brought up under Nazi occupation in Denmark. She's lived in Scotland for 59 years. Why is she being forced to register in a country she's called home for almost the last 60 years, Prime Minister?
Say to the right honourable gentleman, we want to ensure that EU citizens who are living here have their rights protected. We want to be able to ensure that they have the necessary support that they need and indeed the recognition of their status here in the United Kingdom. If the right honourable gentleman is interested in defending and protecting the rights of EU citizens here in this country, then I hope he will vote for the deal which does exactly that.
Mr. Speaker, what a disgrace. A woman that's lived here for almost 60 years and the Prime Minister wants her to register to stay here. Mr. Speaker, Tovey has children. She has grandchildren. She has married in Scotland. She has friends here. She has built her life here, Prime Minister. Why is the Prime Minister making Tovey register after almost 60 years? Will she end this heartless policy? Will the Prime Minister tell Tovey, tell all EU citizens who've come to the UK to work, to live and to love, that the UK is their home without precondition?
Right, honourable gentlemen, we have consistently said to EU citizens who have come here, who've been living here for many, many years, as in the example he was given, and for others who've come here more recently, we recognise the contribution they have made to our society. We recognise the contribution they've made to our economy. We want them to stay. That's why we put EU citizens' rights at the front of the negotiations with the European Union. It's why we have negotiated those citizens' rights in the withdrawal agreement, and it's why this government has given a confirmation and has given a guarantee that those rights will be protected even if we leave with no deal. That is the right way to protect the interests of EU citizens here in the United Kingdom. And the right honourable gentleman should be recognising the commitment this government has given to all EU citizens in the United Kingdom. This is their home. We want them to stay, and they can stay.
Chris Phil. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 5 years ago, my constituent Barry Bednar's 14-year-old son Breck was brutally raped and murdered. The perpetrator is now serving a 25-year prison sentence. However, in recent months, the victim's family, including his teenage sister, have received repeated, very distressing and disturbing communications on Snapchat purporting to be from the perpetrator, graphically recounting the circumstances of the murder. The police have asked Snapchat to provide the data that would help them definitively identify who has been sending these messages, for example, data about the device from which the messages were sent. But Snapchat is referring the police to a mutual legal assistance treaty with the US, and the police would have to go through a one-year process to get this vital data for their investigation. Does the Prime Minister agree this is completely unacceptable? Does she join me in calling on Snapchat and other social media companies to promptly cooperate with police inquiries? And if they do not do so, does she agree that legislation is required?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, obviously the case that he's raised is one of great concern, and I know that members across the whole House will want to join me in sending our sincerest sympathies to Breck's family. And I'd like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to Breck's mother for her brave and powerful campaigning on the wider issue of internet grooming. The Ministry of Justice have assured me that they're urgently looking into this issue, and I'm sure they will update my honourable friend as soon as possible. I agree with him. We want social media companies to recognise the responsibility they have and to work with law enforcement agencies. I know my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has written to my honourable friend to meet him and hear more from the family. It has become increasingly difficult for UK law enforcement to access data if data containing information on threats to UK public safety is held or controlled in other countries. And that's why the government did recently legislate. We recently passed the Crime Overseas Production Orders Act, which will give law enforcement agencies the power to obtain electronic data controlled by providers outside the UK, where an international agreement is in place. And he raises the United States. We expect to establish the first such agreement with the United States.
Phil Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I raised with the Prime Minister a couple of weeks ago, Conservative governments have taken £6 billion out of the North East since 2010. The government now proposes to give back £15 million a year over 7 years through the Stronger Towns Fund. At that rate of repayment, can the Prime Minister tell the House by which century the monies owed to the North East will be repaid?
To the honourable gentleman, as he knows full well, we have been investing in the north of England. We're investing in transport across the north of England. We've been investing in our public services. We're investing in the health service, and the North East will benefit from that as well. We now have, since 2010, in the North East, there are over 35,000 more small businesses, over more than 18,000 new affordable homes, and over 305,000 children are at good and outstanding schools in the North East. That shows that the hard work of this government is paying off and the people of the North East are benefiting.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this week, the owners of the Westgate shopping centre in Basildon terminated Smart Parking's contract after a disastrous 9 months of operation. Yeah. I have now discovered that Smart Parking have signed a shared business service agreement with the NHS. Can I ask my right honourable friend to ensure that before any contracts are signed, that the Department for Health fully research the impact the practices of Smart Parking could have on their users, customers, clients and staff?
Yeah. Can I say to my honourable friend, obviously he's raised an important issue, and the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care will be happy to meet him to discuss this further.
Travis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Amidst the noise of the Brexit debate, there's a real risk that we lose sight of the reasons why so many people voted to leave in the first place. So I think that if we want to restore faith and trust, we need to devolve more political making decision away from Whitehall and closer to the people who will be affected by those decisions. So, following on from the very constructive meeting that took place at Fountains Abbey in North Yorkshire with the Communities and Local Government Secretary and the Yorkshire leaders on Friday, can I ask the Prime Minister personally to engage with the substance of the One Yorkshire devolution deal with a view to reaching an agreement that will best serve the interests of the people of Yorkshire?
I say to the honourable gentleman, I think he's a living example of devolution of powers from this Whitehall out to the areas through the mayoralty that he is serving. On the issue of Yorkshire devolution, we recognise that there is, recognise the discussion and debate that there has been on this issue. The One Yorkshire proposals didn't meet our criteria for devolution, but my right honourable friend, the Community Secretary, has met Yorkshire leaders. Discussions are continuing, but the priority remains the implementation of the agreed Sheffield City region deal, which will bring £900 million of investment to the local area, which I'm sure he will welcome.
Mr. Speaker, it was with profound sadness that I saw my constituency this week join the all-too-long list of areas across our country to have lost a precious young person to knife crime. The public don't want to see politicians throw blame at one another for these stolen lives. They want to see them take responsibility for what is within their control, provide resources necessary, and then demonstrate a relentless and total commitment to snuffing out violent crime. I welcome the announcement of an emergency summit, but what action will the Prime Minister be taking after that, constantly, to drive performance on these issues until we get the result the public rightly demand to keep children safe?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, as I did earlier, any death of a young person at the hands of violence is a terrible tragedy, and I recognise, as she says, her constituency has become seen just one of the latest examples of a young life cut short far too early. Can I also say to her, yes, what we are doing is bringing, as I said, bringing together ministers, local government, police and other agencies. This needs to be a cross-society approach in terms of dealing with this issue, because it's not just about catching the perpetrators of the crime, it's about preventing the crime from taking place in the first place. That's one of the reasons why the government will be launching a consultation on addressing this as a public health issue. There has been excellent work done under what was Strathclyde Police Force, now Police Scotland, looking and using the public health approach. What that does is ensures that all agencies, not just across government, but in other parts of in local government and elsewhere, are able to be brought together to deal with this issue. And what I want to do at that summit is to hear directly from those what further action government can take, which we can then put in place to deal with the issue.
McMorrin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my daughter's 16th birthday on the 29th of March, and it's her generation that will be most impacted by Brexit. Perhaps the Prime Minister could give her an early birthday present and delay Brexit until she has informed the House as to the status of the police and NCA investigations after Vote Leave and Leave.eu were found guilty of corrupt activities by the Electoral Commission.
I say to very simply to the Honourable Lady, as I think she's discussed the issue of delaying Brexit with me before, can I just simply say to her, this Parliament gave the people of the United Kingdom the decision to choose whether to leave the European Union or to stay in. They chose to leave the European Union. I think for trust in politics, it's important that the government delivers on just that.
Richard Bacon.
Mr. Speaker, you are right that the former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull is very welcome here today. As he said in a lecture last night, if a state-sponsored adversary has enduring access to staff, software or hardware deployed into a target telecommunications network, then they only require the intent to act in order to conduct operations within the network. Would the Prime Minister explain how, given that Chinese law obliges all Chinese companies to assist the Chinese intelligence services, what implications there are for British government policy?
I say to the Honourable Gentleman, we look at these issues very seriously. As regards the issue of 5G security, we're looking at the right approach that we need to take. We want to be able to benefit from that new technology, but of course we need to manage the risks closely. And we're considering a full range of policy options. Our review into 5G is still ongoing and no decisions have been taken.
Blackburn.
Mr. Speaker, in January, 83% of Scottish MPs voted against the Prime Minister's deal. Last night, a historic vote took place in the Welsh Assembly and the Scottish Parliament, both parliaments simultaneously rejecting the Prime Minister's deal. Isn't it the case that the Prime Minister has no mandate from Scotland for either no deal or her deal?
So we entered the European Union as the United Kingdom. We will leave the European Union as the United Kingdom. And I also say to the Honourable Lady that the SNP has no mandate from the Scottish people to continue to pursue independence.
Rebecca Powell. Order. Difference of opinion is of the essence of politics. There is an elaborate combination of finger-wagging and head-shaking going on, which may be personally therapeutic, but is institutionally disadvantageous. In any case, we owe the Honourable Order. We owe the Honourable Member for Taunton Dean a decent hearing. Rebecca Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure who's in charge of the washing machine in your house, but were you aware that every time you or I or anyone else puts on a load of washing, 700,000 tiny microfibres get washed down the drain and into the marine environment, causing untold damage? The UK's 68 million loads of washing.
And what are you doing about it?
Contribute. The UK's 68 million loads of washing done every week contribute a staggering 9.4 trillion microfibres to the environment. As many colleagues, including me, try to reduce plastics for Lent in a campaign masterminded by my friend from Chelmsford, would the Prime agree, would the Prime Minister agree that this is a great time to address this issue and carry on the great record this government has?
I think by now the wash would have been completed. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to my honourable friend, she has raised, despite the laughter, she has raised a very important issue. And can I thank her for continuing to be a champion of our environment? And she did an enormous amount of work which led to the government ban on microbeads. And she's now raising the issue of microfibres. She's raised those members across this House who are seeking to reduce their use of plastic during Lent. I think it is incumbent on all of us to be seeking to reduce our use of plastic, not just during Lent, but for time to come.
Deirdre Brock!
Mr. Speaker, and can I say, as one of the Aussie MPs in this House, how much I share his appreciation for Australian tennis players. I would add my personal favourite, Yvonne Goolagong-Cawley, who was such a brilliant inspiration to so many of us when I was growing up in Australia. The Prime Minister has been refusing to answer for a year now my questions about the visit of Aggregate IQ to Downing Street. So can I ask her about the visit of Alexander Nix of Cambridge Analytica to Downing Street in December of 2016? It was reported in the Spectator's Coffee House blog, but not in the Transparency data. So can I ask the Prime Minister, who did Alexander Nix meet in Downing Street? What was the purpose of the meeting? And most importantly, why was it not reported in the Transparency data?
To the Honourable Lady, she's raised a specific issue with me, which I will look into, but she says that we didn't respond on the question of aggregate IQ. My honourable friend, the Minister for the Constitution, has written to the Honourable Lady about this and responded to her query.
Antoinette Sandbach.
Mr. Speaker, women's football is one of the fastest growing sports in the world. And I hope you, Mr. Speaker, and my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, will welcome the £70 million investment Cheshire FA is putting into developing a women's football training centre in Winsford. And can I invite the Prime Minister to come and open the facility and take part?
Can I thank my honourable friend for her invitation? As I said earlier, I was pleased to congratulate the England women's football team, and I'm sure the whole House will recognise the important work that's being done by Cheshire FA. I think it's a very exciting project. I welcome the commitment that they're putting to providing this new world-class facility for women and girls football in Cheshire. And can I just say that I will look very closely at her invitation. It sounds like a very interesting one, but of course I can't commit my diary on the floor of the House.
Mary Black!
My constituent arrived early to her ESA assessment as requested by her assessors, only to be told that she would have to wait another 90 minutes to be seen. Now, she has an open wound, so sitting for any great length of time causes her great distress and pain. So after her 90-minute wait, she was then told that she wouldn't be seen and would have to make another appointment altogether. And I believe it's actually happening right now. So does the Prime Minister think that it's right that my constituent have to go through this humiliating process all over again?
Can I say to the Honourable Lady, obviously she's raised what sounds like a very distressing individual case. I will ensure the appropriate Minister writes to her about it.
Thompson!
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last week, MPs heard harrowing testimony from family members of a man who tragically committed suicide because he faced the loan charge. A 20-year retrospective tax facing thousands of families in my constituency and across the UK. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister said on the 9th of January that the Government accepted the review into the loan charge. Yet the loan charge APPG was only advised this week by the Treasury that there is no such review. Mr. Speaker, the Treasury have acted in bad faith, so will my right honourable friend now personally intervene to ensure a genuine review and an urgent delay into the loan charge so that this review, as promised, can be carried out?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his question? And obviously he's raised the issue which is of concern to not only his constituent but others across the House. I will ensure that he receives a response from the Treasury which sets out exactly what is being done in the review that is being taken place.
Dr. David Drew.
Mr. Speaker, last Saturday morning with 3 colleagues I met with the heads and governors of Gloucester schools. Each school outlined the impact of education cuts on their particular establishment. but they agreed on one thing that the Prime Minister could make a real difference on now with regard to special educational needs. And I hope the Government will consider this. First, will the Government make sure that the additional needs budget is fully ring-fenced and invested in schools rather than lost somewhere on the way? And secondly, will we take away this ridiculous perverse incentive where the first £6,000 for any education, health and care plan has to be found by the school themselves? If that was to be done, it would make a dramatic difference to our schools. I raised this in the debate on Monday, but unfortunately the Education Minister was unable to confirm. Will the Prime Minister make a confirmation that the Government will look into this and do something about it?
I say to the honourable gentleman that we recognise we've asked schools to do more, and that's why we've recently announced an extra £350 million to support children with complex special educational needs, and that includes an extra £250 million into the high needs budget across this year and next, and that's building on the £6 billion in place for this year, the highest level on record. We've also put an extra £100 million to create new school places, to improve existing facilities for children with special educational needs and disabilities, and that takes our total investment on that to £365 million through to 2021. He raises the question of the money actually going direct to the schools. I suggest that he needs to sit down, I'm sure he has, but sit down with the local authority and discuss with them how they are using the money that is being made available to them.
Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week marks the beginning of Brain Tumour Awareness Month, and I bring attention to the House to the event that happens immediately after this PMQs in Westminster Hall. Good progress is being made to find the right care and cure for people who have brain tumours. But could I ask my friend the PM if she will meet with the Prime Minister, if she will meet with me and others to discuss how we can improve the life chances of children and young people who survive the brain tumour itself but are left with brain injuries. Essential therapies and support for children in this situation and young people is not consistent and often lacking, leaving them with significantly impaired life chances.
My honourable friend has raised a very important issue, and I'd like to thank the Brain Tumour APPG for all the work that they have done on this issue. I think it is essential to recognise the needs of parents and carers of children to ensure that the right support is in place when and where they need it. And that's why those diagnosed with cancer, including children with brain cancer, will be benefiting from a tailored recovery package individually designed to help them live well with and beyond cancer. As my honourable friend mentions, it's not just the dealing with the cancer, it's thereafter that is an important element of this as well. And NHS England is accelerating rollout to ensure full implementation by 2020, which was as recommended by the Independent Cancer Task Force. I understand that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, will be going directly to the event that my honourable friend referred to, and I'm sure that the appropriate Minister in Health and Social Care will be happy to meet and go through this in detail.
The Prime Minister will be aware of our concerns about attempts to prosecute members of the security forces who conscientiously and courageously defended all the people of Northern Ireland against terrorism. Will she assure me that any proposal to provide greater legal protection for our armed forces will include those who served in Northern Ireland?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, we have been clear that the current system for dealing with the legacy of Northern Ireland's past isn't working well for anyone. Around 3,500 people were killed in the Troubles, 90% were murdered by terrorists, and many of these cases require further investigation, including the deaths of hundreds of members of the security forces. The system to investigate the past does need to change to provide better outcomes for victims and survivors of the Troubles, but also to ensure that our armed forces and police officers are not unfairly treated. And that's why we are working on proposals. We're working across government to see how best we can move forward. We're carefully considering the very large number of responses that we received to the consultation on this issue. We'll be publishing our next steps in due course, and the MOD are looking at what more can be done to ensure that service personnel are not unfairly pursued through the courts, including considering legislation.
Colin Clark. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The SNP Scottish Government has resurrected Alex Salmond's call for a Scottish currency. Does the Prime Minister agree this is reckless and risks destabilising the Scottish economy?
Can I say to my honourable friend, I seem to recall back in the 2014 referendum that the SNP were absolutely adamant that Scotland would keep the pound. There have been a few changes since then. They've gone through looking at the option of the euro, then they went back to sterling, now they're into an independent currency. This government is working to secure a Brexit deal that protects jobs and our economy. The SNP should focus on that rather than continuing to pursue their independence fantasy.
Marcia de Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The DWP are currently carrying out 5 reviews into disabled people wrongly deprived of social security support because of the flawed personal independence payment assessment. My constituent, Mr. De Laurentiis, was given just 0 points despite being unable to prepare food for himself or even dress himself. Recently, we have learned that there are over 4,000 people were wrongly deprived of their DLA when reassessed for PIP. 17,000 people have died before their PIP decision was reached, and over 72% of those cases that go to an appeal tribunal are overturned in favour of the claimant. So when will the Prime Minister follow Labour's policy and scrap this discredited and flawed personal independence PIP assessment framework?
Can I just very gently say to colleagues, I am trying to accommodate as many backbench members as possible, and I say, and it applies to both sides of the House, some extremely serious public purpose focused questions are being put, but they're too long. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In relation to the SA underpayments, obviously the mistake shouldn't have happened. We need to clear this up as quickly as possible. The DWP is taking the issue very seriously. They've got around 1,200 people working on sorting the issue out. We've already paid out almost £330 million, and the Department expects to finish correcting the majority of the original cases by April. It's aiming to process additional cases by the end of the year.
Anne-Marie Trevelyan.
Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, pupils from Tweedmouth Community Middle School won the National Motorship Stars Trophy for secondary schools for their amazing work to encourage more pupils to cycle to school. Would the Prime Minister join me in congratulating the school and their head, Mr Hulbert, and his team of staff, who are committed to creating a fitter, greener and more environmentally focused next generation of Berwickers?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, I'm very happy to join her in thanking and congratulating Tweedmouth Community Middle School for the excellent work that they've been doing, encouraging pupils to cycle to school. It's clearly an excellent achievement, and we congratulate them, as I say, because we all know the importance of keeping our young people active. And I'd like to congratulate Mr Hulbert and all the teachers, but particularly the students who've actually taken this up and put it into practice. It's a very good example for schools across the country.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My constituent Yvonne Chafee's 4-year-old son Logan is the only child in the whole of Europe with chromosome 7p duplication syndrome, which causes epilepsy and autism. Hardly any prescriptions of medicinal cannabis have been allowed to date, and with Logan being so unique, he will always be denied access under the current rules of proven benefit. So what changes can be undertaken to allow Logan to access cannabis products to ease his suffering without his family having to go through a very high-profile public campaign?
So obviously the honourable gentleman has raised a distressing case about his constituent. We have taken the steps to ensure that medicinal cannabis is available. The decision on that availability is one that is taken by clinicians, and I think that is absolutely right, that that's what should be done.
Paul Scully.
The introduction of the Domestic Abuse Bill and hopefully the successful passage through this House. Does my right honourable friend not agree with me that, as well as tackling extreme abuse and violence, that we should also be able to raise awareness of the entry levels of acts of coercion, deceit and manipulation that lead to more extreme examples?
Yes. My honourable friend has raised a very important issue, and I think people will obviously have seen distressing cases of coercion that have led to that, and indeed some instances where this has been taken through the courts. I think we all need to recognise the importance of dealing with domestic abuse and recognising that for too long this issue of coercion was not accepted and was not addressed. It's important, it's this government that is doing so, and as he says, we must be very clear about the entry levels, about the levels which actually lead to this, lead to the distress.
Chris Stevens.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Today is the 10th anniversary of the blacklist of construction workers being exposed
And today, various news reports on the extraordinary admissions found in the Creedon report that the police and special branches across the UK and security services supplied information to the Consulting Association. So does the Prime Minister agree that there now requires to be a full stand-alone UK public inquiry into the human rights conspiracy of blacklisting so that truth and justice can be served and those responsible for blacklisting can be held to account?
Say to the honourable gentleman, he raises an issue that has been raised on a number of occasions in the past in relation to this question. Of course, the government has responded on this in the past, and I'd be happy to write to him on it.
Thank you. This Ash Wednesday, will the Prime Minister give strong encouragement and support to the 48 Conservative MPs who are taking on an environmental challenge? And because we've seen the devastating impact of plastics across the world, will she also give a big shout out to all members of the House who are taking on a plastic pledge and raising the good work of Tier Funds and DFID in reducing plastic pollution?
Prime Minister.
I say to my honourable friend that I was pleased to see many honourable friends giving up plastic last year, and I'm pleased to hear that many colleagues are, as she says, planning to support Tier Fund's pledge on plastics. Through UK Aid Match, the UK government will match donations of up to 2 million raised by Tier Fund supporters for a project in Pakistan. We are committed to the UK being a world leader in tackling plastic pollution. Honourable members of this House are showing by their example the role that the UK is taking, and I congratulate them and applaud them on doing that.
Sir Vincent Cable.
The Prime Minister will recall the advice she received from her Conservative colleagues, as well as mine, about the dangerous folly of making landlords responsible in criminal law for immigration control. Following the High Court ruling of Mr Justice Spencer that her policy is now increasing the risk of racial discrimination, will she not accept that her policy is fanning the flames of racism in return for nothing but tougher rhetoric about immigration control?
Minister.
I think it is absolutely right that the government has taken the approach that we need to consider when people are accessing different services whether or not they have a right to be here in this country. My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has a written ministerial statement has been issued in response to the case in the courts, and I understand that the government is appealing that case.
That's all right.
Order. Yes, I believe that I will come to the right honourable gentleman. I think there's a point of order from Mr Ian Blackford. I hope it's a genuine point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I have to say it's disappointing that the Prime Minister, who has been alerted that I will be making a point of order, has chosen to scurry from the chamber. Mr Speaker, you will agree that the use of language and the images and what we say in this chamber is important. The Prime Minister said in response to my honourable friend from Aberdeen that the Scottish National Party does have a mandate for independence. Mr Speaker, let me say quite unequivocally that is simply not the case. The Scottish National Party stood on a manifesto commitment of an independence referendum if there was a material change of circumstances. Now, it might be a surprise to the Prime Minister, but we won the election. But perhaps more importantly, Mr Speaker, we took a motion to the Scottish Parliament because there is emphatically a majority for independence in that Parliament. And we won that vote in March 2017 by 69 votes to 59. And I wonder what mechanisms are open to me, Mr Speaker, to make sure that the Prime Minister comes back and corrects the record and accedes to the fact that the Scottish National Party and the government in Scotland does have a majority and a mandate for independence.
Well, what I would say to the right honourable gentleman is as follows, and for the benefit of those interested in this matter. First, he has made his point with vigour and insistence, very much in the mould that he has fashioned since his election to the House. No one could be in any doubt as to what the right honourable gentleman believes, and it is on the record. Secondly, and I don't know whether this will be welcome to the right honourable gentleman, but it is the honest answer from the Chair. There has been no procedural impropriety. There has been no breach of order. There is nothing untoward in parliamentary terms about the way in which the Prime Minister has conducted herself. I recognise that it is disagreeable to and strongly objected to by the Right Honourable Gentleman and his colleagues here assembled. That, I'm afraid, however, is in the nature of political debate and disagreement. As to when he will have a chance further to pursue his disagreement with the Prime Minister, I think that opportunity will arise ere long. Well, if the Honourable Member for Anhelion and Yar has got a genuine point of order, he's certainly wearing a fabulous tie. Whether his point of order is of equal quality remains to be seen. I will nevertheless give him a chance. Mr. Angus Brendan McNeill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I accept the reciprocal compliment for my tie. Mr. Speaker, the point here is, it's a matter of fact, it's a matter of truth, that the Prime Minister, what she said is not the situation in Scotland. There is a mandate for independence. The Prime Minister said there was not a mandate. There is a mandate for independence. That's the fact.
I'm not sure that that greatly added to the intellectual quality of the exchanges, but nevertheless the Honourable Gentleman has made his point with some force and it is on the record. But I don't think it requires a response from the Chair at this time. I'm sorry if I've misunderstood, but I feel that he's just put his point there and it rests and it will be assessed and evaluated by all colleagues. Well, I'm going to come first, if I may, to the Chair of the Brexit Select Committee. Point of order, Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Next Tuesday, the House will vote again on the withdrawal agreement. The Secretary of State for exiting the European Union was due to appear before the committee yesterday, but cancelled for perfectly understandable reasons, because he was in Brussels with the Attorney General negotiating, and we of course accept that. We have offered him other times this week and next Monday afternoon, none of which have been accepted so far. Now, while we understand that negotiations will continue, I was very surprised to learn this morning at a meeting of the committee that the Secretary of State's office has offered times to individual members of the Select Committee for him to meet them later on Monday afternoon, but has not so far confirmed that the Secretary of State would be available to appear before the Select Committee. Now, given that next Tuesday we may well be considering further legal assurances relating to the withdrawal agreement, the committee is absolutely clear that we must hear from the Secretary of State before we vote on Tuesday. Now, I would not normally raise a point of order on such a matter, but given the urgency of this and the profoundly unsatisfactory state of affairs, what advice could you give the committee, Mr. Speaker, to secure the Secretary of State's attendance, which is his job, before our committee, before we vote next Tuesday?
My advice is simple. Persist, persist, persist. And I would say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, who is held in the highest esteem, I think, in all parts of the House, that if he, on behalf and clearly with the agreement of the committee, seeks the presence of the Secretary of State prior to an important debate and attendant vote, the Secretary of State should appear before the committee. That cannot be compelled, certainly not by the Chair, but it is manifest and I think incontrovertible that it is desirable in terms of the scrutiny and accountability process, from which something else follows. Simply offering individual meetings with members of the committee does not remotely pass muster. The fact is that the Select Committee is an established body in this House, established to scrutinise the government's Brexit policy, and the committee has a corporate character. Indeed, members of it are operating not merely as individual members of Parliament, but as part of a body politic, in this case, part of that Select Committee. So my advice to him is that he should persist, making it absolutely clear that it is the view of the committee that the presence of the Secretary of State is desired. It is, frankly, if I may say so, a point so blindingly obvious and in ethical terms. So be quiet, young man. And it is so manifestly fair that is... Be quiet, young man. That is what should happen. Thank you. OK, point of order, Toby Perkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This Friday I will attend the funeral of Charles Smith, MBE, who, when he died at the age of 98, had been a member of the Labour Party for 84 years, which I believe made him the longest-standing member of the party. In paying tribute to him, could you give me guidance as to how I might use this as an opportunity to encourage all people within Parliament to celebrate all those people who've given long service to our political parties and recognise that the vast majority of people who do that do it for reasons to support their communities and the country, and recognise that our political parties are broadly a force for good and we should welcome their membership.
I don't dissent from that. The honourable gentleman has made his point very well. It doesn't require anything further to be said by the Chair, but I congratulate him on taking his opportunity. Point of order, Mr Vernon Coker.
Mr Speaker, you've been extremely helpful in ensuring that Parliament can hold the Executive to account with respect to knife crime. Is there anything further we can do to ensure that, given what the Prime Minister announced today about a knife crime summit, what the Home Secretary has done today in terms of meeting various police chiefs, is there anything you can advise me to ensure that at the earliest possible opportunity that either the Home Secretary or the Prime Minister comes to this House and gives us an update with respect to this extremely important issue?
Well, the answer to that is, in terms of parliamentary opportunity on the floor of the House, there is a chance tomorrow, and indeed there is a chance on Monday. So I think the opportunities are there, and it's up to members whether they seek to seize those opportunities. I hope that's helpful to colleagues. Thank you. Yes, indeed. Point of order, Mr Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Would you please advise me how I can best clarify the record in respect of comment I made at business questions on the 20th of December 2018? I highlighted the work of two campaigns in the City of Glasgow. One, called Saving Lives, led by Duncan and Margaret Spears, was started in the wake of the tragic death of their 28-year-old son Christopher Spears in an accident in the River Clyde in 2016. Their campaign is seeking to promote water safety and to ensure that vital life-saving equipment is implemented on the banks of the River Clyde and across Scotland, and most importantly that throw ropes are attached to life belts. I also raised another campaign, the Think Again campaign, that is seeking to install emergency lifeline telephones on the River Clyde to support those who are in urgent need of emotional support. For the avoidance of any doubt that may have arisen in my original remarks in this House, I wish to emphasise that these two campaigns are separate with distinctive objectives, and both are doing excellent work in their own respective ways to preserve life in the City of Glasgow and further afield.
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. He asks me how he can best clarify the record in respect of what he said in the House in December. My response to him is that the honourable gentleman has proved to be the architect of his own salvation. By the device of this point of order, he succeeded in clarifying the matter and putting the facts very clearly on the record. In the process, he's highlighted again the excellent work of these two campaigns, and I thank him for doing so. If there are no further points of order, we come now to the urgent question. Debbie Abrahams.
To ask the Work and Pensions Secretary if she will make a statement on changes her department intends to make on social security and employment support, including the assessment process for disabled people and people with health conditions.
Thank you. Minister Sarah Newton.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Yesterday, the Secretary of State provided a written statement to the House and delivered a speech at Scope that included, amongst other announcements, changes to the delivery of health and disability benefits. We are making significant progress in improving people's experiences of claiming disability benefits by working through the recommendations made by several independent reviews of PIP and ESA. But we need to continue to make improvements to better support people with health conditions and disabilities. The written statement set out a number of additional measures we will implement to make improvements now and in the future to support disabled people and those with health conditions. We will improve and simplify people's experience by no longer undertaking regular reviews of PIP awards for claimants at or above state pension age unless they tell us that their needs changed. We'll also be transforming the delivery of assessment services. We've established a health transformation programme to undertake the significant task of transitioning the current separate work capability assessment for employment and support allowance and universal credit and the PIP assessment services into one unified integrated service from 2021. To enable an integrated service, we are extending the contract for the Health and Disability Assessment Service, which includes the delivery of the Work Capability Assessment, and aligning it with the duration of the extended PIP contracts. This will allow for a safe and stable service now as we transition to the new integrated service. The DWP will also be testing how we increase engagement and build a trusted and strong relationship between work coaches and people awaiting an assessment in universal credit, and those found to have limited capability for work, and the Minister for Employment will take this forward. The Health Transformation Programme will be co-designed with disabled people. The Secretary of State and I will be regularly engaging with disabled people, disabled people's organisations and charities. All of us, whatever age or need, want an equal chance to live a life of opportunity and fulfilment. We intend to support disabled people in all phases of their life so that the pursuit of equality is a shared goal.
And Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for granting this urgent question. And I thank the Minister for her response. So I'm disappointed that the Secretary of State wasn't here to answer particularly, and that this was a response to an urgent question rather than actually doing an oral statement, given the extensive scope of the proposals that were made. I welcome yesterday's announcement that there will be no PIP reassessment for disabled people over state pension age. But why aren't all disabled people, particularly those with progressive conditions such as motor neuron disease, multiple sclerosis and cancer, being exempt from repeat assessments? I have a constituent with terminal secondary breast cancer that's gone into her bones, and she's being refused PIP. The launch of a new transformational programme where PIP and work capability assessments will be integrated by 2021 is interesting, given that previously the government said this couldn't be done. So how exactly will they be merged? Who's involved? I'm grateful that the Minister has said that they will be co-designed with disabled people, but could she commit to supporting the principle of nothing about you without you? Will there be a pilot? If so, where, when? What's the sample size? Will there be an independent evaluation? Who will provide the new service? There are real concerns at the profiteering that has been enabled by this government at the expense of disabled people. There are also worrying reports in various GP journals this week that the medical records of claimants will be made available to the Work and Pensions Department, or their social security support will be denied. So I'll be grateful if the Minister can confirm that this is not and will not be government policy. Obviously, there are huge issues around privacy and ethics. There is also strong evidence of the physical and emotional harm these assessments are having on disabled people over and above their condition. What is being put in place before 2021 to improve the poor quality, validity and reliability of these assessments? On UC and the role of job coaches in determining limited capability to work, the detail of this was most unclear in the written ministerial statement. So can she expand on this and confirm that work coaches may start an assessment to determine a claimant's capacity to work? Can she also confirm a shift in the government's approach to sanctions and expand on the department's approach to conditionality? I welcome a review into the inadequacy of social security support for disabled people and more widely. Poverty is a political choice, and we know that 4.2 million disabled people have been pushed into poverty as a result of the £5 billion cuts since 2010. So what form will the review take, and again, who will be involved? And ultimately, Mr. Speaker, on the government's more ambitious targets to get disabled people into work. Again, the pendulum is swinging back. The Conservative general election pledge in 2015 was to halve the disability employment gap. It's actually 4.4% lower than 2015, and then in 2017 it was about 1 million additional disabled people getting into work. But there was nothing about access to work. Finally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, what is going to happen? Mr. Speaker, I do apologise. What is she going to do about the cultural changes which are needed in her department to ensure that disabled people and other claimants don't feel demonised, even dehumanised, as happens all too often?
Minister.
I fear that I'm going to test the patience of Mr. Speaker if I try and answer all of those at once, but I will do my very best. I very much welcome the tone of the Honourable Lady and the welcome that she has given to the measures that were announced in the written ministerial statement. Clearly, we've been listening very hard to members across this chamber and, most importantly, to disabled people themselves about the changes they would like to see, and that is what's driven the changes that we are going to be making. And I absolutely want to confirm that throughout the process, in fact, it is how we work now, that we engage fully with the disabled people, enabling them to help us develop the services which are for them. The Honourable Lady touched on a few things about people being repeatedly reassessed. So I would like to remind her that we did bring in the severe conditions criteria so that people who have reached the highest level of support on PIP will not be routinely reassessed. So we've introduced a 10-year light touch review. So many people with the sorts of conditions and illnesses that the lady described will not be undergoing further reassessments. We do have a special process for people who are terminally ill, but we do know from research that I've undertaken this summer, and I've been delighted to work with the Honourable Lady from Bridgend and the work that she's been doing, is to really look again at how these special rules for people who are right at the end of life are working. And I'm pleased that we've worked very closely with the medical profession, who I think weren't often aware of the special processes that could so easily be put in place to enable people to get benefits within days. And I'll be shortly announcing some new guidance, which is the fruition of the work that we've been doing over the last few months. I really just want to remind everyone that in the transition from DLA to PIP, many more people with mental health conditions are now receiving support, and particularly at the highest levels. And also concerns been raised about work coaches and their ability to work with people with disabilities and health conditions. And I just want to reassure the House that all of our work coaches are receiving extensive training and will continue to do so. Over 10,000 work coaches have already received training in mental health services. And so I do believe that that personal relationship that we really want all of the people claiming benefits to have with their work coach is really a possibility and is actually happening the length and breadth of the country. We are looking at conditionality, and we have taken up the recommendations given to us that when people are applying to universal credit who have severe disabilities and health conditions, that there is no conditionality, that conditionality will be switched off, and then as the relationship develops with the work coach, if and when they are prepared to take those steps to work, they will be fully supported by their work coach and other resources that they have available. In terms of the new service, we have been listening and working with a range of stakeholders before the announcement, as you would expect, to develop this. And I can absolutely commit to the House that the co-design will be ongoing, and there'll be plenty of opportunities for everyone in the House to be involved in how we take that forward. But the simple ideal behind it is to reduce the amount of assessments that people have to take and reduce the amount of information they have to give to the department. We've all heard in our surgeries each week, particularly for people who are in receipt of both ESA and PIP, that they can be asked to do a whole number of forms where they're giving us the same information, going to assessments where they give the same information. And the whole aim of this is to reduce that, to simplify it, so people give us the information once and we're able to make the best decision we can right from the outset.
Thank you. Mr. Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It never made sense to me why we pay different contractors who compete with each other to recruit competent staff to carry out assessments for which make many disabled people feel like it's a duplicatory process. It adds to the stress. So can I strongly welcome today the decision to combine the ESA and the PIP assessments and make the system more efficient and also hopefully give more dignity for disabled people?
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and it really builds on some of the work that he started when he was in the department, and it's very much based on listening to people and their experience of the current benefit system. And I couldn't agree more that we need to have a much more streamlined, simplified process, that people tell us the information once, we gather the information once, and we're able to make the best possible accurate decisions the first time.
Marshall O'Condeva.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I firstly congratulate my right honourable friend for securing this urgent question today. As we saw yesterday, the Secretary of State announced changes to social security, disability and health, and by my calculations she made no fewer than 9 different announcements in her statement. The government will now hand over more money to the Centre for Health and Disability Assessments, or better known as Maximus, to continue to carry out the WCA assessments, and this is despite the failure year on year by the department's own performance standards, and no less than 36,000 ill and disabled people wrongly being deprived of social security as a result of the WCA. So can the Minister state why, therefore, the government has decided to extend the contract for another 16 months? And will the Minister finally consider actually bringing these assessments back in-house? The government has announced that it is looking to merge both the assessments for PIP and ESA into an integrated assessment service and use a digital platform to do so. So would the Minister not agree that there are serious risks involved in combining both of these assessments? And when the standard decision-making for PIP and ESA is subject to so many failures? And given the consistent failures with the online platform for universal credit, what confidence shall ill and disabled people have that this won't actually happen for them when they are going through a process to access vital social security support? Over a million sanctions have been imposed on disabled people since 2010, which has shown to be counterproductive and cruel. But so far, the government has just committed to a small test review into conditionality and sanctions. So why won't the government follow Labour's pledge in actually scrapping the punitive sanctions regime? The government has once again moved the goalposts in terms of employing disabled people. First of all, it was halving the disability employment gap, and now they're going to review it yet again. But it is actually time for the government to consider expanding the Access to Work programme rather than simply reviewing its employment targets. There are currently 7 reviews being conducted for disabled people being wrongly deprived of social security support. These changes are just a drop in the ocean, so will the Minister finally accept that there needs to be fundamental reform and not just tinkering at the edges?
Minister.
I really would have hoped that today, of all days, that the Honourable Lady opposite could have found it in her heart to have welcomed changes which have been asked for by so many people inside this chamber and outside this chamber, to recognise the very great work that's been done by disabled people and people working with disabled people to actually engage with us so constructively that we can actually move forward and tackle the issues that she is describing. Now, the Honourable Lady is right that yesterday we also said we were going to be more ambitious for enabling more disabled people into work, because we've made such good progress. Since 2013 and 18, over 930,000 more disabled people are now in work. So over that time, the disability employment rate has increased from 7.4% to 51.5%. And the gap between disabled employment rate and overall employment rate has reduced to 30.2%. Now, I don't want to see any disabled person who would like to be in work out of work, but that is progress, and that's why we've committed to review our targets to be more ambitious. Access to work is a great scheme. We all agree. And what we have seen last year is record numbers of people being supported on access to work. More people with mental health conditions, more young people with learning disabilities. This Access to Work Fund is demand-led. Every year it grows because every year we're seeing more disabled people into work, and that's what we want to do. Now, returning to the questions that the Honourable asked about the contracts, it's really important to me, while we've got such fundamental transformation of our assessment process, that we have a safe, stable delivery for those people currently applying for benefits. And that's why we have extended the contracts to 2021 to align with the PIP contracts. Now, we haven't just accepted the existing situation. As the Honourable Lady knows, and I'm very grateful to the work that the Select Committee undertook, we have been pushing for continuous improvement within those contracts. And the new contracts that we've given have higher standards of service delivery, and I would be very happy to put a letter in the library so people can see the terms of the new contract to see that they are driving forward improvement, because it's what we all want to see in this House is the right decision being made at the first opportunity. We do not want to see people having to go through mandatory consideration and then on to appeal in the court. So we've got a whole series of reforms to make sure that that does not happen.
Mark Harper.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome what was in the written statement yesterday and what the Minister has reiterated about a more ambitious target to get more disabled people into work. And if I may say so, as an aside, Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome what the Honourable Lady who secured the urgent question said. As the then Minister for Disabled People, I'm particularly attracted to the more ambitious target we had in our 2015 manifesto. I may indeed have had a hand in perhaps writing it myself. But on the substantive question, though, is if we're going to get more disabled people into work, we need to make sure the social care system, the budget for which, over half of which is spent on working age adults, not on older people, we need to make sure that system works better with our social security system and with the other things we have to help disabled people become more independent. So can I say to the Minister, I would urge her to publish the social care green paper as soon as we can to start that needed debate so we can deliver those policy changes that many disabled people across the country are crying out for, to give them the opportunity to live more independent and fulfilling lives.
Minister. I very much thank the contribution of my honourable friend, not just in the chamber today, but when he had the privilege of holding this particular office and all the work that he did there. And he's absolutely right that we do want to be more ambitious, and we will be looking very carefully at how we can set ourselves really ambitious goals to make sure everybody in our country has the opportunity of fulfilling their potential in work, and businesses and civil society and the public sector can draw on the talents of the very many disabled people who at the moment are unemployed. And my honourable friend is absolutely right to talk about the importance of adult social care. And of course, it is the Department for Health that leads on this. But I do work very closely with them, and I've been encouraging them to go ahead and publish this very important green paper so that we can take forward those urgent reforms to enable more people to live independent lives.
Brendan O'Hara.
This announcement was something of a missed opportunity, an opportunity to completely overhaul the punitive PIP assessment process, which is deeply flawed and continues to be criticised by claimants and stakeholders. The latest PIP Assessment Tribunal statistics show that from June to September of 2018, a staggering 72% of cases found in favour of the claimant. Well, the Minister will be aware that Scotland is taking a wholly different approach, proposing to significantly reduce the need for face-to-face assessments, introducing rolling awards with no set end point, and ensuring that those with fluctuating conditions will not face additional reviews. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is what a system based on dignity and respect looks like. So what is the government doing to address the fact that claimants are still being wrongly assessed at such a staggering rate? And will she look at what the Scottish Government are doing to reduce that burden that is being placed on disabled claimants? And will she also agree to study very carefully the responses to the consultation announced yesterday by the Scottish Government on delivering a fairer disability assistance benefit programme in Scotland?
Minister. I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and I'd like to reassure him that I do work indeed with my opposite number in the Scottish Government, that we work very closely so as we go through the process of PIP and other benefits being devolved to Scotland. And actually we are testing and learning a great deal from each other. The UK Government is investing a great deal in health and work trials, and we work very collaboratively, and we're always prepared to learn from any part of the United Kingdom. But while I absolutely agree that too many people are having their decisions overturned on appeal, and I want to make sure that we make all of the decisions right the first time, I think it's worth keeping in perspective that 10% of all the PIP claims go to appeal and only 5% are overturned. But of course, I'm always saying from this dispatch box, one person's poor experience is one too many. And we have been doing a lot of work with the Courts and Tribunal Service to bring down the period of time people have to wait. And I hope all honourable members will join with me in welcoming the fact that we now have a new PIP online appeal service. So since November, people can resolve these appeals online, which is really enabling far swifter resolution of those issues.
John Howard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I had produced a list of things that had gone wrong in the claims procedures for constituents, and I provided those to the Secretary of State's predecessor to help her shape these reforms. Will she undertake to dig that paper out and to have a look at it and to make sure that those reforms can be implemented?
I very much thank my honourable friend for his contribution, and I'll go better than that. I'd like to invite him in to meet with me and go through his paper and all the hard work he's put in to making sure that we get this right going forward.
Anne Clewett.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. While we all support any improvement in the lot of disabled people, I have one of the highest percentage of disabled people in my own constituency because of past industrial disease and so on. And one of the things I remember is the grief that was caused to so many people who were forced to reclaim and appear before various groups of people to reassess them. I still think there are too many people still in that category, and I hope the Minister will persist with that in the improvement. Can I just ask her about the situation of Remploy? We had a big fight in this chamber over Remploy, she may remember, and we were told that alternative jobs would be available. Can she actually give us the figures? Because in my own constituency, I know that too many people who are employed in Remploy are still out of work.
The Honourable Lady raises a very important point about reassessments, and through a series of measures that we've taken this year and the ones we've announced, far fewer people will be reassessed. We want to make sure that people are getting the support which they need, because under the old legacy system, people were just parked on benefits for a very long time and were missing out. And the evidence of that is the amount of people who get more money on PIP than they did on DLA. So it's actually important that people are assessed to make sure they're getting all the support to which they're available. Remploy in Wales is doing a great job as part of our health and work programme, and we've also introduced new supported ways of employing people, such as iPairs. And I'd be very happy to write to the lady and describe what's happening in Wales. And if she does feel that people are not in employment that should be employment, then please come and meet with me and let's look at those cases.
Kirsten Hare.
Speaker, first of all, I warmly welcome these changes that my honourable friend has outlined. Last week, the Scottish Government announced their timetable for replacing personal independence payments, disability living allowance, attendance allowance and carers allowance. Now, this is now not going to be completed until 2024, 3 years after they initially promised. So can my honourable friend reassure me and my constituents and all those in the House that the DWP and the UK Government did all they possibly could to ensure the Scottish Government were set up for this, and actually it's a resistance from the Scottish Government to take the powers? Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that very important question. She's absolutely right that there is absolutely commitment from my colleagues in the DWP to make sure that the Scottish Government can take on those powers, and we haven't created any delays whatsoever. The delays are all in Holyrood.
Kate Green.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A few moments ago in Prime Minister's questions, the Honourable Member for Paisley and Renfrewshire South raised the case of a constituent who had turned up for a disability assessment, been faced with a very long wait and eventually had to rebook the appointment. And the Prime Minister suggested that either she or perhaps the Minister before us now would look into that case. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's not an isolated matter. I too have constituents with exactly the same experience, including a gentleman who last month had an appointment with CHDA, and despite having told them that the nature of his condition meant he would need to be seen very quickly, was forced to wait for an hour and 40 minutes. I very much welcome the Minister's offer to place in the library information about the contract that has been issued to these assessment companies. We need to be able to scrutinise the performance standards and the rate at which they are achieving or failing to meet them. So will she repeat that commitment to the House, just so we can be absolutely clear that information will be available to us?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and I wasn't in Prime Minister's questions to hear of that particular example, but of course I'll be following it up with great urgency. And it's not acceptable for people to have appointments cancelled at the last minute or to be asked to wait, and that certainly isn't the service that we expect from our contractors. With great urgency, made the commitment to, the standards within the contract that we're assisting and that we monitor very carefully compliance with, and there are penalties. And there are penalties within the contract if people fall short of the high standards we expect them. Every person with a health condition and disability must be treated with respect and dignity.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Madam Deputy Speaker, may I thank my honourable friend and her colleagues for listening so much and making these changes, but could I ask her to have a look at the question of face-to-face assessments and whether there could be more done either by paper-based reviews or home visits, because it is pretty difficult for some people to get to these assessment centres, certainly from my constituency, and also some people who have mental health conditions find these assessments incredibly stressful.
I thank my honourable friend for his question and also for his long-standing, passionate championship of the vulnerable people in his constituency and across our country, and we have listened very carefully to what he's had to say. We have increased the amount of home visits that can be undertaken, but I definitely want to go further and wherever possible make decisions based on the information that we're provided by the medical profession and by the disabled people themselves or those people supporting them to reduce the number of face-to-face assessments that are needed. They are all undertaken by qualified healthcare professionals, and we do keep their training under review, but I do want to make sure that we have only those face-to-face assessments which are really necessary.
Neil Coyle.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Can I congratulate my honourable friend on securing this question and share the welcoming of the exemption of those over state retirement age from routine reassessments? Can I ask the government to look again at all those with learning disabilities and progressive conditions being exempt, but also all those who've only secured a benefit ESLPP through the tribunals process? And whilst the Minister's right that some disability organisations will welcome fewer assessments, the fear and anxiety for disabled people is that the high error rate in existing processes will be transferred. So can the Minister say more about, in detail, how that process will be improved and how individual disabled people and disability organisations can help shape any new process and when that will begin?
I'd like to reassure the honourable gentleman that that work is all underway because there have been several independent reviews of PIP and ESA, and including a review by the the Pension Select Committee, all of those recommendations that we are working through now to make sure that the assessments are as accurate as they can possibly be. So we are not waiting. The huge benefit of the Transform service is that the DWP will own the whole claimant journey. We are building a whole digital platform. We'll be able to far more easily use the medical information and other information that we get to make that decision right the first time. But as I said at the beginning, the whole new process is going to be co-designed with disabled people.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. So I welcome the announcements, particularly around the combination of assessments to bring in better service for those seeking to make the claims. Yet the issue that's regularly picked up is about actually having a more independent record of some of the assessments that are done. What further consideration is the government giving to things like video recording of assessments that not only might give confidence to the person taking part, but also allow for quality control reviews and an easier process in tribunal as well?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for raising video recording, because it is our hope that video recording will bring a lot of transparency and trust and confidence into the assessments. We have undertaken a very successful initial pilot, and we're reviewing the findings of that at the moment, and we remain committed to rolling out video recording.
Liz Kendall.
The Minister should know that there really are serious problems with PIP and work capability assessments. I have lost count of the number of constituents who've come to see me in a desperate state because of the lack of understanding and awareness, particularly if they have fluctuating physical and mental health problems. The fact that 83% of people with multiple sclerosis who appeal their PIP case are successful shows how flawed the current system is. So can I ask the Minister, on this specific point, how will the assessment process and the training and skills of those delivering it actually change to address these serious problems?
Minister. I thank the Honourable Lady for a question, but I think, inevitably we want to make sure that we get this process better. And each time I come here, I describe to you the steps that we're taking. So specifically on the case of people with multiple sclerosis, or when people come and bring me their cases of where they feel that their conditions are not being properly understood by the healthcare professionals, I make sure that the healthcare professionals meet with those people, that they look at the guidance together and they update the guidance and the training that is used by the frontline people undertaking the assessments. And we get positive feedback from that. Look, every year we look at independent research into the experience of people undertaking these face-to-face assessments. It's really important to me that people feel that they are being listened to. And 89% of people said that the assessor had treated them with respect and dignity. And in the high 80s, people are saying they had time, that they felt listened to, they were able to. Now, that is still not 100%, and we are working towards 100%. But I do think it's important, because we do not want people outside listening to this debate feeling petrified about going along to have an assessment when we know the vast majority of people have a positive experience when they do go along. Well, we are continuously working to make sure that we're improving the process for everyone.
Thank
you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is welcome news for many pensioners who will not now have to undergo repeat appointments, but it doesn't address the fundamental flaw in the system to which the Minister has herself alluded. 72% of PIP and ESE appeals still find in favour of the claimant. Ethos, maxima, capita, they're not doing the job properly. So rather than looking to improve that, would the Minister not consider bringing the assessment in-house so that it can be done properly?
I gently point out to the Honourable Lady that when you're talking about ESA, it's 8% of people who applied to ESA go to an appeal and 4% are overturned. Now, I don't want it to be 2%, I don't want it to be 1%, I don't want it to be 0.1%. I want us to get the decision right the first time, but we must use the information accurately. It's very important that we're evidence-based policymakers. But when it comes to 2021 and who is going to be undertaking the assessments, the healthcare professionals undertaking the assessments, I've always been clear that by creating this transform service and by creating our own digital platform, many more people will be able to come forward and say that they would be able to undertake those services. And I would particularly be very happy if it was NHS trusts that came forward and said that they would undertake those services.
George.
Thank you very much. I welcome that the ministers are looking to improve the accuracy of assessments for PIP and ESA and to reduce the number of appeals. But it still takes 48 weeks for an appeal to be heard in my constituency. And can I ask the Minister to look urgently at the way people are treated whilst they are awaiting an appeal? My constituent had a serious heart condition. His doctor said that he was not fit to go back to work. The DWP said that that was their decision, not the doctor's decision. My constituent died on his first full day back at work that he was forced into. He was awaiting his appeal. It's too late for him. His wife has asked if I can take it up with ministers to seek a better solution for people who are waiting appeals, so many of them who are rightly and justly appealing.
Minister.
Well, I'd like to pass on my sincere condolences to the Honourable Lady's constituent. And of course I will sit down with her and review that case in great detail, because that is really, a very, very sad thing to listen to, that happened to her constituent. What we are doing is the Department for Justice and Tribunals have employed hundreds of more people into the tribunal service so that the cases can be heard sooner. And I think the particular thing I'm pleased that we've introduced is an online resolution service, so that once people's information is uploaded onto the system, the DWP decision makers can look at that, and if we can make a decision earlier which even prevents people having to go to a tribunal, we will do so. So I'm very hopeful that we'll start to see, the waiting time significantly reduce.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My constituents in Glasgow North East have seen £2 million taken out of their pockets as a result of the transition from disability living allowance to personal independence payment, but that's not the full story. Often people who are in claimant of these disability-related benefits are part of a wider series of social security payments, and they've been subject to a freeze since 2016. Indeed, for example, child benefit is subject to a 23% real terms decline in its real value since 2010. So that's obviously going to harm those in receipt disproportionately. So what will the Minister be doing? Will she be writing to the Chancellor of the Exchequer to end the benefits freeze and ensure that it is at least tied to inflation so that we maintain a level of dignity in our social security system?
Minister.
I'd like to say to the honourable gentleman, it's not true at all that the benefits for disabled people have been frozen. Just this House, just recently, has uprated those benefits by 2.4%. This year we'll be spending £4 billion more than we did 10 years ago, and all the benefits supporting people with disabilities will continue to grow to 2020. All through this Parliament they will be growing.
Karen McCarthy.
Mr. Speaker, at a recent surgery I held for carers, a woman came along with a case relating to her daughter who has disabilities, and we managed to get a back payment of £22,000 in disability payments. Now, if I hadn't held that surgery for carers, and if the excellent local carers organisation hadn't put that lady in touch, her daughter would still be waiting for those payments. We can't have a situation where it relies on that fortuitous circumstances getting justice for people. What can the Minister do about that?
Minister.
I think the Honourable Lady makes a really important point, and we know that too many people have been missing out on billions of pounds of benefit, and that's why I hope she'll welcome the fact that universal credit and the personal relationship that people have with their work coaches is going to enable people to understand the full range of benefits that are available to them. Our partnership with Citizens Advice, working with the job centres, will be able to signpost more people to get more support. And I hope colleagues on the other side of the House will spend some time in their job centres understanding that the range of services and signposting that's now available from the work coaches.
Karen Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. These are very, very small changes in the right direction, but they do recognise that the system does not work. Now, in order to perhaps better understand the impact of government policies on particularly ill and disabled people, can the Minister commit to publishing constituency data on the number of UC50 forms that are issued to claimants and the number that are returned? Because without proper detailed information on this, we will not be able to understand the impact on our constituents.
Minister.
I'll thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and I will certainly take that suggestion away and see if we can collect that data and if it's possible to provide it on a constituency basis. But I mean, I really do want to challenge people when they say the whole system has failed, because from the information that we have, we can see that there are millions of people benefiting from these benefits, and more money is spending every year. So it's very important that people have the confidence to come forward and actually access the benefits to which they're entitled. And we remain committed to reforms of the work capability assessment brought in by the Labour government in 2008. And we have taken a lot of time to consult with a lot of people, and while everybody can agree that it needs to change, there is no consensus for how it can change, and we're continuing that work because I'm determined to see these improvements be made.
Hugh Gaffney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think we can all agree that the social security staff are under a lot of pressure dealing with these claimants we've heard today. So would the Minister agree with me that those who administer the social security should be supported in employment with adequate pay by this government, while the civil service receiving 0.25% to 1%, those who took the bribe, increase in real time as a cut? Will the Madam
Thank the gentleman for his question, because it gives me a wonderful opportunity to pay tribute to the fantastic, hard-working, dedicated, compassionate staff in the DWP, both in our operating centres and also in our job centres. And I can absolutely assure the honourable gentleman that we have overall, I understand from our lead officials in the department, they have very good working relationship with the trade unions, and that they're listening very carefully, and we're working very hard to make sure that people are fairly rewarded.
Thank you. We now come to a statement from the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Secretary Greg Clark.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to make a statement about workers' rights when we leave the European Union. But before I do, Madam Deputy Speaker, since this is my first time at the dispatch box since his death on Friday, can I put on record my deep appreciation of the life and work of Lord Bhattacharya, a heroic figure in British manufacturing. Lord Bhattacharya's work attracted investments to which hundreds of thousands of working men and women owe their livelihood. A Labour member of the House of Lords, Kumar worked easily with ministers and indeed prime ministers from all parties for the benefit of people of the West Midlands and indeed the whole nation. Madam Deputy Speaker, the United Kingdom and this Parliament have a proud record of improving the rights of working men and women, from Shaftesbury's Factories Acts to William Hague's Disability Discrimination Act. From the minimum wage introduced by a Labour government to the national living wage brought in by a Conservative government. And while the EU sets minimum requirements in many areas of workers' rights and health and safety requirements, time and again Britain has been in advance of them and has chosen to exceed them. The EU Agency for the Improvement of Working Conditions ranks the UK as being the second strongest in the whole of the 28 member states, behind only Sweden, for well-being in the workplace. The UK offers 39 weeks of statutory maternity pay compared with the 14 weeks required by the EU. We've given fathers and partners a statutory right to paternity leave, something that the EU is now. Our national living wage is the highest in the EU, and the low pay commission that advises on it is widely respected. Because we have not in practice been limited to EU standards, there's no reason why we should not maintain this record of leadership outside the EU. The Prime Minister has given a commitment that Brexit will not be allowed to erode workers' rights. Nevertheless, some honourable members during previous debates have advanced the view that there should be a parliamentary mechanism established to monitor and to implement that commitment. The Honourable Lady for Great Grimsby introduced a private member's bill to that effect, and the Honourable and Right Honourable members for Bassetlaw, Don Valley and Stoke-on-Trent Central, amongst others, proposed an amendment to a previous motion in a similar vein. We've been discussing closely with members across the House, with trade unions and businesses, how we can turn this intention into law. So the Government is today publishing draft clauses for inclusion in the Withdrawal Agreement and Implementation Bill to put these commitments into law. There are two main features of the clauses. First, there will be a new statutory duty placed on ministers bringing forward a bill that affects employment or workplace health and safety, that they should certify before second reading of any such bill that it is compatible with the principle of non-regression that the Prime Minister has given. They'll be required to provide explanatory information to Parliament in support of that statement, which would have been drawn up following consultation with businesses and trade unions. This will ensure that while respecting and upholding the sovereignty of this Parliament, members of this House in future will be able to consider very clearly the compatibility of every proposed measure with the non-regression principle, to which the Prime Minister has given a commitment. The second aspect of the draft clauses concerns future EU legislation. Parliament will be given the opportunity, at least every 6 months, to consider any changes to EU workers' rights and health and safety standards in the workplace. This will be reported to Parliament through a document which has been subject to consultation, again with employers and trade unions, and which will be scrutinised by the relevant select committees of the House, subject to their agreement. The Government will be required to table an amendable motion on its intended course of action on those new EU rules. For example, the Government may set out that it intends to legislate to give effect to those commitments, or that it intends to give effect to them in a different way, or that it does not intend to give effect to them, setting out its rationale. There are a number of legislative proposals currently under consideration in the EU which have a deadline for transposition into national law, which will be after the implementation period. We would expect them to be put forward for Parliament's consideration under this new process. These draft clauses will be published in a command paper today, and they combine well our determination to honour the commitment that the Prime Minister has made not to see workers' rights weakened, along with respecting the sovereignty of this Parliament. A similar framework will also apply to environmental protections as the UK leaves the EU, implemented through the Environment Bill. On the 19th of December, we published the draft Environment Principles and Governance Bill, the first part of a much larger Environment Bill to follow in the next session. The draft bill outlines our proposals to establish a world-leading body to hold the government to account for environmental outcomes after the UK leaves the EU. The draft bill also requires the government to publish a statutory policy statement on the interpretation and application of 9 environmental principles, including the 4 contained in EU treaties. And the government will legislate to ensure that when future bills could affect environmental protections, a Minister of the Crown will make a statement of compatibility to Parliament and provide explanatory information. We'll also create a new statutory duty on the government to monitor any strengthening of environmental protections and regulations by the EU and to report regularly to Parliament about the government's intended course of action in those areas. This will give Parliament the information it needs to consider whether or not domestic protections need to be strengthened accordingly. Through these commitments, the Government will provide a robust framework for maintaining and strengthening environmental standards as the UK leaves the EU. In addition to these measures that I've described, I'm also announcing today steps that will strengthen the enforcement of employment rights. The vast majority of businesses operate fairly and treat their employees well. But I've been concerned, and I know many members of the House have been, about the practices in a small number of firms, in a small number of industries, where abuses of the conditions at work are used to the detriment not just of workers, but of reputable competitors who suffer a disadvantage by comparison in those industries. So I intend to consult broadly on establishing a new body to bring together the relevant enforcement functions of the Gangmasters and Labour Abuse Authority, HMRC and the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate. As part of the forthcoming spending review, we'll consider what level of funding is appropriate to ensure that it is adequately resourced to deliver a strengthened remit. Madam Deputy Speaker, the measures that I've announced today reflect a process of engagement across this House and including with employers and trade unions. Not everyone will agree with every proposal. But if, as I hope, an agreement can be reached on the withdrawal process during the days ahead, it serves as a helpful guide as to how we might find and act on common ground across the House in the next phase of the negotiations. And I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I also put on record my sadness and deep appreciation for Lord Bhattacharya and his devotion to British industry and politics. Now, I must start by thanking the Secretary for his engagement with me over recent weeks and indeed with trade unions and my parliamentary colleagues whom he's mentioned already, the Honourable Member for Great Grimsby, the Right Honourable and Honourable Members for Bassetlaw, Don Valley and Stoke-on-Trent, who've unrelentingly championed the protection of British workers as we leave the EU and continue to help us move the position across the House to one that we're all content with. But as he knows from our discussions over recent days, sadly the proposals as drafted don't yet provide full guarantee nor assurance for UK workers, and I do hope that this spirit of collegiality will continue and that we'll work together quickly to address my concerns and provide the changes and assurances that I seek. Now, as he knows, the TUC have stated today, in the face of a government determined to reduce rights, these measures would in no meaningful way compensate for the loss of the protections that currently exist. The assessment of less favourability will be decided by parliamentary majority and not by the objective standards of the UK courts. The provisions can be easily revoked by a hostile government, and even without being revoked, they can be rendered fairly meaningless in practice. Indeed, the content of the proposed statement of compatibility and a regular parliamentary assessment of less favourability are not actually capable of legal challenge by any UK worker as drafted. Now, of course, the process outlined in the draft clauses could be, of course, subject to a judicial review, but simply issuing a statement and laying a motion are hardly rocket science. But what will not be possible, however, is a challenge to the contents of a statement of compatibility or an approved parliamentary motion to accept a government assessment. Now, I think the Secretary, in his statement, implied that we should not automatically accept favourable rights solely because the UK Parliament has already set higher standards of employment rights. And on that point specifically, let me be clear, no one, certainly none of the colleagues that I have spoken to, is seeking anything other than that UK workers should be entitled to no less favourable rights at work than their EU comparators, not that we should accept unfavourable ones, a point which is very simple to draft and could be made perfectly clear, and I'm happy to work with the Secretary on this point. Now, of course, Parliament is, of course, always welcome to give more, but history has been littered with examples of the UK bitterly resisting EU directives on workplace rights. In the case of the Working Time Directive, it was a Conservative government which sued the EU Commission, claiming that there was no legislative base for the directive since working time had nothing to do with health and safety at work. Luckily for workers in the UK and the rest of the EU, it lost. Now, on the promise not to water down existing rights and protections, even if a bill is found to be incompatible, there are at present no powers to stop the government proceeding. Neither does the promise apply to secondary legislation, causing existing EU-derived rights potentially to become watered down with ease. Given the bulk of EU legislation within the UK to implement EU law is actually by way of secondary legislation, and to give the examples working time regulations, TUPE, health and safety regulations, just to name but a few. On the process relating to adopting future improvements in EU legislation, the proposals are equally in need of address. The only means of challenge is in Parliament, an amendable vote subject to the government's majority. Parliamentary procedure may not permit sufficient amendments to actually deal with all the additional changes to workers' rights identified by MPs. And in any event, resolutions of the House have recently proved to be an ineffective restraint on the government. Of course, the Secretary seeks to provide comfort by stating the government will consult with workers' select committees and employers' representatives, and that sentiment is, of course, welcome. But as he knows, there's no direct obligation on the government to accept any recommendations. Now, finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, on enforcement, I do welcome the commitments the Secretary has made to address the issue of funding deficiencies, and I await further details in due course. On the 1st of April 2004, there were 1,483 HSE frontline inspectors. By 2015, this had fallen to 972. In consequence, the statistical average workplace can now expect an inspection no more frequently than every 50 years. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have conveyed to the Secretary over recent weeks a guarantee of non-regression to be meaningful, truly meaningful, must be enforceable in the UK courts at the suit of any worker in the UK, and any dispute as to whether or not the worker has less favourable rights than her EU comparator must be determined by the courts and not solely by Parliament, still less by a politically motivated government majority in the House of Commons. Today's proposals come nowhere near this and do not yet demonstrate that the government takes workplace rights seriously. But I do hope, however, that in this spirit of cooperation, we work together to move towards more robust guarantees as a matter of urgency.
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much. Can I say to the Honourable Lady, I warmly welcome the tone in which she's approached this. I know that we come from different preferences as to what would be ideal, and that both the TUC and I think her own front bench would have preferred EU directives automatically to take their place in UK law and to be enforced through the ECJ as they are now. She knows that we disagree with her on that. In our view, it wouldn't be consistent with leaving the European Union or with the sovereignty of this Parliament. But I accept that that is her position, and what she has said is, notwithstanding that, we should explore whether we can meet the observations, perfectly reasonable, that she mentions. So I'm grateful for that. In terms of what we've published, they're draft clauses, and we're publishing them this afternoon. They haven't gone in the bill yet, and I'm open to working with all members of the House, of course continuing to include her, to see which of the observations can be accommodated subject to the approach, the general approach that we wish to take. I think she recognises, and I hope members will recognise, that this is an important opportunity. If we are to pass a withdrawal agreement implementation bill, the chance to have from the outset on the statute book, literally within the next few weeks, I hope, some important protections for workers is one that I think we should all take. She asks some specific questions, and I'll attempt to answer as many as I can here. Of course, she makes an observation which is, in effect, that future governments, future parliaments may take a different view from that which we intend. It is a fact, as we know, that, that no parliament can bind its successor, but what it can do is to express a clear intention and to set up a test and to provide mechanisms against which a proper scrutiny can be mounted of any proposal. And that is what we do here, and I acknowledge the contribution, in fact, the origination of this on the part of her honourable friends. She's concerned that the statements that are provided for could be ignored and may not be as effective as she intends. Clearly, the case law establishes that where there is a statutory consultation that is provided for, it can't be lightly swept aside. There is a requirement properly to engage with the recommendations that come from that. But I hear what she said about that being open to workers as well as people who might represent them, and we can talk more about that. She asks about the application to changes to workers' rights in the future that may come outside primary legislation. Clearly, the big changes do come through primary legislation, but in the spirit of what I said earlier, I'm certainly open to exploring what assurances we can give on other significant pieces of legislation that might be in scope. In terms of the jurisprudence of the ECJ that she mentioned, clearly it would be inappropriate for the ECJ after Brexit to have a remit in the UK. But of course, as she knows, as a lawyer herself, any court can have regard to the decisions of any court that it considers to be relevant in the case that they're considering. She mentions the matter of enforcement, and I think we strongly agree about that. There are industries, sometimes concentrated in particular places in our country, where I think what she describes is correct, that there is a calculation made that employers who abuse the rights of their workers are unlikely to be detected and enforced against, and that leads them to think that they can get away with that with impunity. The intention of the strengthened body that I set out today, and our intention in terms of resourcing it, is to firmly remove that from the minds of any such employer, and I will work closely with her on that. It is, I think, appropriate to recognise and to draw some pride in this House on our record of employment rights. We have a successful labour market. It combines a reputation for high standards, standards that have been recognised across the EU as being amongst the best in Europe, but at the same time having what is the most important right for workers, which is the right to work. And many more people are able to work in this country as a result of the effectiveness of our labour markets. So we need to preserve that whilst giving expression to the objectives that have been expressed by the Honourable Lady's colleagues to make sure that the commitment that we've given to build on that strength in the future is something that is not just a matter of words, but has parliamentary force behind it. And I'm grateful for what she said about working together.
Sir John Redwood.
I'm assured that the Government and this Secretary of State want high standards of employment rules in this country, and I look forward to us having independence so that we can have our own domestically crafted high standards, which will be above the minimum EU standards. But can the Secretary of State please explain why he's proceeded with this statement today? Because I thought the sole aim of it was to win over the Labour Party, and it seems that they are in complete disagreement with it.
It was very much influenced by the exchange that took place between my right honourable friend and the honourable member for Bassetlaw when his amendment was moved. And as I recall, my right honourable friend correctly intervened on the Honourable Member for Bassett-Law to reinforce his personal commitment to establishing and maintaining Britain as a place of voluntarily high standards. And because I think that does represent a point of agreement in the House and is a reflection of our traditions, our reputation is of a place of high standards, and that is the accretion, if I can put it that way, of steps that governments of both parties have taken. I think this is an opportunity to work together and see if we can establish something that is rooted in the sovereignty of this House, something that I know my right honourable friend quite rightly insists on, but can provide the assurance to those who want to see measures as well as words.
Chris Stevens.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State started with by talking about his political party's record on workers' rights. He'll forgive me if the political party who put into legislation the Master and Servants Act of 1823, which codified corporal punishment for workers, has got a good record on workers' rights, and indeed bringing us up to date the Anti-Trade Union Act. Yeah. Can I say to the Secretary of State, I think that rather than guaranteeing or protecting workers' rights, this statement does no such thing. In fact, it would be a misrepresentation to suggest otherwise. The Secretary of State will be aware that currently the EU are discussing regulations on the gig economy and rights for working parents, which are far better than can be found in the current government's Good Work Plan. So can the Secretary of State tell us, if those regulations come to pass, how they will be dealt with by the government in this chamber? Is he committing the government, given that we keep getting told the next election is 2022, is the Secretary of State committing the government to at least match EU regulations? And given that the statutory instrument process is being used to weaken workers' rights, as we saw recently with the denying access to European work councils, what makes him believe that we should trust the government on this? And would he, as a gesture of goodwill, perhaps put forward an amendable motion to the House on the government's Good Work Plan that will allow members of the House to strengthen regulations, particularly around our contracts and eliminating them, and sorting out the status of workers?
Yeah. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. In terms of the Good Work Plan, we will be bringing forward an employment bill that, of course, will be amendable in the manner of legislation. But this provides us with a more immediate opportunity. That is for the next session, whereas I very much hope that the withdrawal bill will be available during the weeks ahead and provides that immediate opportunity to express our determination to apply the commitment that the Prime Minister made on this. When he mentions the gig economy and the measures that are being contemplated by the European Union, actually it is a fine example of what I said. Actually, it follows the commitments that we've made in the Good Work Plan, and they are now making their way through Brussels. We were in advance of that, and I think, as I made clear in my statement, both those directives would go through the procedure that I described and would be available to the House if they think there's anything extra in that. But actually, we think that it is modelled in many respects on our own proposals. In terms of the ability of this House to enforce high standards, this has been the tradition. I think if he talks to his counterparts across the European Union, my experience as a minister at European councils over recent years is that our record of high standards when it comes to workers' rights and employment protection and health and safety is looked at with admiration by many of our counterparts across the European Union. This allows us to continue that leadership.
Rebecca Powell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to welcome this statement and the clauses therein. And does my right honourable friend agree, and he's been touching on it just now, that it is often the UK rather than the EU that has led the way on not just workers' rights but also environmental standards, and we should be proud of this, Madam Deputy Speaker? And could he confirm that today's announcements will ensure that we continue with these high standards in both respects, but in particular in relation to the environment, that we give due regard to any strengthening of environmental protections and regulations by the EU once we leave?
My honourable friend is quite right, and again, if I think of the Climate Change Act and the provisions that were adopted there, they were not required by the European Union. They were a set of decisions that were taken by this House, and that has been our record. The proposals that I've set out allow us to continue to do that, but at the same time to make sure that the House is not only properly informed, but required to make an explicit determination of whether, if there are new policies that are adopted and directives that are proposed, to have them debated and considered in this House. That seems to me to be a good mechanism to ensure that we are always aware of what is being done in the European Union after we have left it.
Caroline Flint.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, yourself and I will remember doing an all-nighter in this House when the Labour government took through the national minimum wage. In fact, we were up here all night long till 9 o'clock in the morning as both Conservatives and Liberal Democrats filibustered and voted against the national minimum wage. I'm glad those days are behind us, at least the all-nighters. But I don't need lectures from anyone on being wary of the Conservatives, but can I welcome the statement today from the Secretary of State and the response by the Shadow Secretary of State as we try to forge assurances enshrined in law to protect workers' rights as we leave the EU. So can I ask, though, and press the Secretary of State, if he could say something more about how we will ensure that any changes on workers' rights and health and safety are consulted on, that they are not cherry-picked by a future government, but also can I support my honourable friend's concerns about the right to judicial involvement for workers who want to make sure that those rights are upheld. Thank you.
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for having initiated this conversation through her amendment to the previous motion, and I think it has been a fruitful discussion that has come from that. In terms of the ability to, as you put it, to cherry-pick those measures that are adopted by the European Union that might find favour with the government but not those that don't, the requirement would be to report everything that the European Union has adopted during a 6-month period, and for the government to have to make a statement in respect to all of those measures, and the motion that would then be required to be put before the House would be amendable. So the government might say that it intended to implement one measure, to apply in a different way another, but to reject a third. That motion would be amendable so that the House could alter, as it were, the government's intention and express its view directly. In terms of the direct access for workers to these procedures, I made a commitment to the Honourable Lady on her front bench that we would work together to see what can be done on that, and I'm sure the Right Honourable Lady would want to be part of those conversations.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And just reference to the minimum wage bill, I actually whipped the minimum wage bill through committee on that occasion, so I well remember Conservative hostility to it. To say to the Secretary of State, what he's really promised us today is future consultation and future opportunities to votes. And looking behind him, there isn't a great deal of commitment from the benches behind to these sorts of measures. So I just say to him, why can't he go further? Why can't he agree to put a commitment into the withdrawal agreement and the treaty that the UK will never fall behind EU minimum standards on workers' rights, either now or in the future? I know he's mentioned parliamentary sovereignty and not binding future parliaments, but governments historically have negotiated treaties and parliaments have approved them, and those treaties are binding on future parliaments until they choose to withdraw from them. Why can't we have that sort of arrangement?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about legislation here, not the treaty, and the withdrawal agreement has already been established. In the future economic partnership, there is a negotiation to be conducted. It is specified there on our level of alignment when it comes to workers' rights. But this this is in advance of that. This gives the opportunity at the point of withdrawal to give Parliament the ability to make sure that it knows that Parliament takes an informed view of whether it wants to continue to be aligned or not, and that is a valuable opportunity. He says to do it now with the treaty. That is part of the next phase of the negotiations. It's taking, I might say, all of the government's efforts to conclude the withdrawal agreement without being able to conclude the future partnership in the next few weeks. But it is an important opportunity to establish in primary legislation a requirement properly to consider all new regulations that would come from the European Union and to assess the compatibility of legislation that we make in this House with the rest of the European Union. That is, it seems to be a valuable opportunity.
Jack Dromey.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I start by echoing the warm words from the Secretary of State about Kumar Bhattacharya. The Jaguar plant in my constituency is open, employing over 2,000 workers. In no small means due to his Herculean efforts over many years to turn around Jaguar Land Rover. Madam Deputy Speaker, in my previous being on behalf of the Transport and General Workers Union, I took the case of the Eastbourne dustman all the way to the European Court of Justice because a Conservative government refused to apply the Acquired Rights Directive to 6 million public servants. We won, and TUPE was extended to those 6 million public servants. There will not be in future, however, the same enforcement mechanism. And therefore, looking at the words today from the voice of the trade union movement, they've spoken with one voice. In the words of Frances O'Grady, this won't protect, nothing to stop them from tearing up. Her words, no one should be taken in. Our rights are still under threat. Does she understand that residual concern? And that, crucially, unless the government goes significantly further in terms of legally enforceable rights and not just depending upon the whims of future governments, legally enforcement rights, she's right. These guarantees are worthless.
Well, what I would say to the honourable gentleman is that these rights will be enforceable by the UK courts. I meet with Frances O'Grady very regularly. As I said to the Shadow Secretary of State in my initial remarks, I recognise that the TUC have a different preference, which is to continue to embed European rights directly and have them enforced by the Court of Justice of the European Union. That is a different approach. In my view, it's not compatible with Brexit, and so we are looking for a way in which this House, this Parliament, and the UK courts can provide the guarantees that I think everyone in this House wants to give.
Gloria De Piero.
Madam Deputy Speaker, trust is a big issue here. In July 2016, the Prime Minister told the nation, I want to see changes in the way big business is governed. We're going to have not just consumers represented on company boards, but employees as well. Can he confirm that that promise to workers was broken?
No, Madam Deputy Speaker. What the Prime Minister set out in that speech was to have the voice of workers represented in the boardroom, and the action that we have taken in requiring businesses either to establish a worker representative or to have a non-executive director with the function of representing workers, or to have a works council with an influence on the board, was something that I was proud to set out in furtherance of the Prime Minister's assurance.
Justin Madders.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure the Secretary of State can see he's got a little bit of a credibility gap to make up here. He said in his statement that the Prime Minister has given a commitment that Brexit will not be allowed to erode workers' rights. So can he explain why both he and the Prime Minister last week voted in favour of statutory instruments that do exactly that?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very proud of the record that we have in this country and in this government of advancing rights in the workplace. The report that was commissioned from Matthew Taylor, the Good Work report, establishes, way before many other countries, a means of ensuring that the the platform economy, the gig economy, involves changes to our UK law to make sure that people are not disadvantaged by those new platforms. That is a commitment the Prime Minister's given, I've given, but in deference to some of the scepticism that the words of the Prime Minister should be sufficient, this parliamentary mechanism to enshrine a degree of scrutiny and the ability for this House to insist on that non-regression being abided by is the basis of the amendment that was proposed and that we are accepting and acting upon today.
Anne Clewett.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. They say the Secretary of State is a very nice man. I don't know him, but I'm sure he is. But I don't trust the gang he's part of. And I have to say why, because I was a European MP from 1979 to 84. Before that, I took a petition to the European Parliament in 77, arguing for equal rights for men and women. I then became a member of the Employment Committee in the European Parliament. And I'm glad to say some of the things in that petition became law because of the European Parliament, not because of this place. And the Deputy Speaker will know very well that I was once a shadow employment minister when we were actually working on the minimum wage for the opposition. And I know how hard we had to fight every inch of the way, because we were told it wasn't possible, we were told it'll cost jobs, industry won't be able to afford it, etc., etc. In the same way, when the big job losses in steel and coal, I was then a Euro MP for one of those areas. And I took a group of steel workers to Brussels to meet with the Commission. And I know the big criticism of the government that was in place at that time was, unlike Germany, where steelworkers were also losing their jobs, but every man in the steel industry in the Ruhr had another job to go to. Unlike this country, where there was no safety net. And the criticism made then of the lack of social policy of this country, why should I have faith that things have changed when I hear so many factory inspectors have diminished? If you don't have factory inspectors, you don't get people overlooking the kind of limitations in the industries. So I say to him, I would like to believe him, but I'm sorry, I don't.
I'm grateful for what the Honourable Lady said at the beginning and the compliment that she paid me. But I would reflect on the fact she mentioned introducing the minimum wage and the fight that it was. This House is used to having fights and having campaigns. This is what the purpose of this chamber is, to have crusades that are successful. And she will know that so far from that innovation having been rescinded, it was a Conservative government that introduced the national living wage, which was the biggest pay increase for low-paid workers for 20 years. So she should draw confidence in that. She refers to drawing these protections from the European Union. Once we leave the European Union, obviously that basis for a framework of worker rights will not be there. So what we are proposing, the alternative would be simply to have no reference made to what is happening in the European Union. That would be the default. We're responding to some suggestions, I think helpful ones, that have been made by some of her colleagues, that actually this House should keep a close eye on what's happening in the rest of Europe and providing an ability for the House to act on that. I think that's a good idea. I can't say it was my idea originally, it was brought to my attention, but when you recognise a good idea, I think you should back it.
John Mann.
All taken as an MP, delegation of miners' leaders to Brussels to argue for jobs and investment, but we were blocked under a Labour government by the state aid rules that the European Commission enforced on us, and that's why Haworth Colliery in my constituency closed. can I welcome the Secretary of State's openness with his statement, both to amendments from the Labour front bench over the next few days, if there are precise amendments, and indeed, if they're not agreed, for the ability to put amendments to the withdrawal bill that can be voted on by Parliament. In those discussions, would he agree with me that when it comes to health and safety, having also negotiated the derogation for one section of workers under the Labour government from the Working at Heights bill, because of the way in which the Commission framed the legislation, that there will not be automatic harmonisation? In other words, we accept everything that comes, regardless of its suitability to specific industries and specific groups of workers, which, when it comes to health and safety, and also sometimes environmental standards, has been a fundamental issue and would be if we had direct harmonisation.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman and for his work in crafting this proposal, and I repeat the commitment to continue to work together as the draft clauses become clauses that are laid, and then, of course, the procedures of this House allow substantial debate in committee and at report on the clauses themselves. I agree with his assessment. It is not the case that every regulation that is proposed by the European Union is ideal and is well suited to our circumstances. Again, from experience in European councils, there is a process that tries to have a set of rules that apply in many different countries, in many different economies, that actually may not be best for the UK economy. And so I think the procedure that we are debating today, and that he has given us the ability to debate, actually provides this House to consider what is the best form of regulation suited to our circumstances and respecting the sovereignty of this House and this Parliament.
This is obviously an extremely important statement, but we do have quite a lot to get other business to get through this afternoon, so perhaps shorter questions and shorter answers might be in order. Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State speaks well, and everybody wishes to listen to him. However, not all of his colleagues are of the same mind, because before Christmas, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Attorney General stood at the dispatch box and boasted that the non-regression clauses in the deal are, quote, not enforceable either by EU institutions or by the arbitration mechanisms under the withdrawal agreement. Not enforceable, Madam Deputy Speaker. So why on earth should we trust these clauses?
The Attorney General was making a statement of fact that the provisions in that agreement are not covered by that arbitration mechanism. That is a statement that accurately reflects the reality, which is one of the reasons why availing ourselves of the opportunity to have a parliamentary mechanism to act on and see implemented that non-regression commitment, put it in the hands of this House, I think is especially valuable.
Jim Fitzpatrick.
Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State accepts there's a lot of scepticism on this side about the government's integrity on this issue, and the fact that the trade unions were invited in so late in the Brexit process only fuels that. But he does say that we've never solely relied on the EU for workers' rights and legislation in this country, and when we leave the EU we will need a framework within which to work, and therefore his statement is welcome. In his recent meetings with unions, other issues like electronic balloting are important to the unions. Have they featured, and how would that demand and others fit into his attitude as to discussions and communications with the unions as part of his statement?
To the Honourable what he says. Of course, I meet very regularly with the trade unions, both the TUC and individual unions, and my responsibilities go beyond the matters today, which are expressly about the European Union. I think what he talks about in balloting is outside discussions on the European Union. But I think it's important to have a good relationship with trade unions, and when there are good ideas that are put forward, the fact that they come from whether his side of the House or whether the trade union movement should not prejudice their ability to be considered fairly and taken forward.
Swinson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Business Secretary knows, as I do, that he has Conservative colleagues who would like to see workers' rights diluted or swept away in the name of deregulation. And who knows, one of them could be Prime Minister before long. So can he confirm that the mechanisms he has outlined could be repealed by a future government passing primary legislation? And isn't it true that exchanging enduring EU protections on the environment and workers' rights for these flimsy mechanisms is like trading in a car that has a lifetime guarantee for a lemon without a logbook just because the floor mats are thrown in?
I disagree with the Honourable Lady. I would say that there are far more of my colleagues who recognise that the benefits for the UK of being a country and a jurisdiction that is associated with high standards rather than a race to the bottom is the way that we will prosper as a country, and I think she should have a little more faith in that. When it comes to, she talks about exchanging the framework that the European Union offers. We're leaving the European Union. I recognise that she'd rather we weren't. And so the choice before us is whether, in leaving, we have no reference to anything that is done now or in the future in the European Union, or whether we create a mechanism that allows this House to see what's going on and to be able to act on it, bolstered by the statutory requirements on any minister now or in the future who would be required to pay due regard to the statements that are made in terms of compatibility. And to the point about not being able to, a future government being able to repeal the whole lot, she knows enough about the British Constitution to know that is available for every law in every circumstance by every House of Commons following every election.
Melanie Young.
Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, I would like to cautiously welcome the statement from the Secretary of State. I do think that we owe it to him to recognise the sincerity with which he has approached the discussions with our front bench, with other members on this side of the House and trade unions to try and seek some form of compromise, because that is what this is. It doesn't meet the gold standard of my bill, I do recognise that, but I do think that there is much to and votable motion. I think, however, there still is a fundamental issue of trust which he cannot have failed to notice, and I suggest that there may be further work that he needs to do to try and reassure more people, specifically perhaps one of the issues that the TUC has raised about the fact that statements from the government might only be made in relation to primary legislation, while much, when it comes to employment changes, come through secondary legislation. So what assurance can he offer the TUC?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for what she said, and I've said to the Honourable Lady for Salford Neckles that we will look, most of the rights derive from primary legislation, and we'll look to see whether there is an ability to provide the assurance that she seeks on that. I'm grateful to her for contributing her bill. She's done the painstaking work of producing a great schedule of directives to which her bill would apply. And what I propose is that we, I hope she won't mind, plagiarise that and introduce that as the basis for our list of directives, so that we can, if not replicate in all respects, at least I think capture the spirit of the private member's bill that she proposed.
Cathy.
Madam Speaker, I thank the Secretary of State for the statement earlier on recognising the abuse by a small number of firms. So will the Minister give a level playing field for workers and industries by stopping zero-hour contracts?
I won't do that, Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, because one of the conclusions of the Matthew Taylor report was that most people, of the small and actually shrinking number of people on zero-hours contracts, welcome that flexibility, and he will know that there are many labour councils up and down the country that have casual workers on those contracts and reflect and say in terms that they are an important part of what their workers want. So I won't do that. But when it comes to enforcement, I do agree with him. I think there are a number of firms. They're not typical by any means, but some of us will have read about some of the abuses in the garment industry in and around Leicester, for example, which simply cannot be allowed to continue without the steps being taken to restore confidence to those workers that their rights will be respected. And that is the intention behind what I set out in terms of strengthening and better resourcing our enforcement mechanisms.
Lou Hay. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think fresh in the mind of those of us who have this scepticism at the commitments made by the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister will be the fact that his party, in coalition with the Liberal Democrats, introduced employment tribunal fees. Yeah. These were ruled unlawful by the Supreme Court, largely because of their hugely disproportionate impact on women and on bringing cases on maternity discrimination. Can the Secretary of State confirm that, contrary to comments made by the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Justice, his government has absolutely no plans to reintroduce employment tribunal fees?
Well, I think the Honourable Lady, I think, is a little churlish in ignoring some other examples. I would have thought she would welcome the introduction by a Conservative-led government of the national living wage, for example. That is something that has made a big difference to many low-paid people across the country. Clearly, the judgment that was made by the court struck down those fees, and we will come back and respect the judgment of the court in proposals that we make as we respond to it.
Bridget Phillipson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I listened to what the Secretary of State had to say, but the fundamental issues here remain the same. This government's Brexit deal fails to protect jobs, fails to protect living standards and fails to protect workers' rights. And I'm sure the Secretary of State will tell me otherwise. But if he's so confident that this is the right deal for our country, why won't he let the people decide and have the final say on this?
The report to the Honourable Lady is that employers, including in her constituency, are very anxious that we should get on and approve this deal because, as I said in my remarks, that the best rights that a worker has is the right to work, and the concerns that come from the uncertainty of not agreeing a deal that has been endorsed by employers is giving cause for concern to many workers up and down the country. So I hope that in the days ahead, as well as advancing this package, which will provide a means for us to have regard to and take decisions on workers' rights, seeing what happens in the rest of the European Union, we will also act to safeguard the jobs of workers in her constituency and mine by approving the deal.
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister previously told the House that one step the government was taking was to abolish the so-called Swedish derogation. But can the Secretary of State confirm that in the regulations laid before the House today, agency workers will be forced to wait till at least 2020 at the earliest for equal rights in the workplace?
What I would say to the Honourable Lady is that, having made the commitment to abolish the Swedish derogation, which previous Labour governments signally failed to do, we have brought forward at the earliest opportunity a statutory instrument to do that. I know that there are representations that I've had from the trade unions as to the timing of that. We'll reflect on that. But I think she would, being a fair-minded Honourable Lady, would acknowledge that we have brought forward very quickly the necessary legislation in response to the policy commitments that we've made.
Ruth George.
Thank you very much. And Madam Deputy Speaker, as well as other tributes made, I'd like to pay tribute to Lord Davis of Coity, who died on Monday, who was a doughty champion of workers and of workers' rights for many decades. But I would also like to put to the Secretary of State that the problems with enforcement of employment rights are not just in particular areas. They cover a widespread area, particularly of young workers, of care workers, of catering sector workers, many of whom are in my constituency and have very few other options for employment. I welcome that the Secretary of State looks to again expand the enforcement of employment rights. Will he commit to group cases being taken to tribunal and for third-party representations to be made to HMRC over minimum wage?
Joining the
minimum wage.
Joining the condolences that the Honourable Lady expressed. She's tempting me to go beyond my jurisdiction in my portfolio. It's pretty broad, energy, industry and industrial strategy. But she refers to matters that are properly for the Ministry of Justice. I'm very happy to talk to the Lord Chancellor and very happy to meet with her if she'd like to talk about the grouping of cases in the way that she described.
Paul Sweeney.
Madam Deputy Speaker, has the Minister secured the endorsement of any trade unions for his proposed course of action? And if he hasn't, what does he propose to do to meet the endorsement of trade unions to his proposals?
Well, Madam Deputy, my ambition is not to secure the endorsement of trade unions. We've had fruitful discussions. I said to the Honourable Lady opposite that I respect the fact that the trade unions would rather things were done in a different way, which is that we continue to import, as it were, the directives and regulations from the European Union and have them enforced by the European Court of Justice. That is their preferred policy. I understand that. I don't think it's certainly not our policy. I don't think it's compatible with leaving the European Union. But that's not to say that since we are leaving the European Union and there is an opportunity to put in statute various measures that will allow this House to consider actions that we take on employment rights, that this is not something which we can establish agreement across this House and to take the advice of the trade union movement, even though they might prefer ultimately a different solution.
Thank you. Point of order, Seema Malhotra.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been contacted by residents in Camellia House in my constituency who are very distraught at being left without a lift for the last 2 months, causing great stress to many residents, particularly those with young families or disabilities. The situation has now become more serious with one of the residents who has had a stroke now being discharged from hospital. First Port have failed to provide any explanation for the delay, nor provide any compensation to residents. First Port have also failed to respond to inquiries from my office since the issue was first raised with them on the 25th of January. Madam Deputy Speaker, what advice could you give me on how to raise this matter in order to get Ministers' attention, so that pressure can be applied to First Port to get the lift fixed and that First Port can be held to account for their clear disregard for residents and their needs?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her point of order and for giving me notice that she intended to raise this. First of all, I'm sure we're all very sorry to hear of the plight facing her constituents. But I hope she will understand that this isn't a matter on which I can rule. However, she's placed her concerns on the record. I'm sure that will be appreciated. And I should also advise her that she could perhaps go to the table office for advice, as I'm sure she knows, for the other ways that she might like to raise this matter on behalf of her constituents. Thank you. Presentation of Bill Layla Moran.
School Uniform Gender Neutrality Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 22nd of March.
Friday the 22nd of March. Thank you. We now come to the 10-minute rule motion. Susan Ellen-Jones.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to amend...
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot. Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot. Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thewlis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
I'm very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.